Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It all started in the summer of 1969. I was just 8 years old, helping my dad with morning chores at our ranch near La Veta, Colorado. The property had been in our family since my grandfather bought it in the 1930s. We weren't rich by any means, but we got by with our livestock: cattle, pigs, horses, and sheep. The ranch sat at the foot of the Spanish Peaks, and most mornings I'd watch the sunrise paint those mountains orange while helping Dad milk the cows. That particular morning in June started like any other. The air was crisp, and dew covered the grass. I remember wearing my favorite red flannel jacket, the one with the patch Mom had sewn on the elbow. Dad was working on the tractor near the barn, and I was supposed to be filling the water troughs for the sheep. I'll never forget what happened next. I was dragging the heavy water hose across the field when I heard Dad's wrench hit the ground with a clang. I looked up, expecting to see him cursing at some stubborn bolt, but instead he was frozen in place, staring at something behind the tractor. That's when I saw it too. Standing there, partially hidden behind our old John Deere, was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall. The early morning sun cast its shadow across the field like a giant's. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown fur, but what struck me most were its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, almost human-like, but with a depth that made my stomach turn. I couldn't move. The creature and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Dad slowly started backing away, gesturing for me to do the same. The being, I couldn't bring myself to call it an animal, just watched us. It had massive shoulders, like a linebacker, and arms that hung down past its knees. The fingers. God, the fingers were so long and human-like. That first encounter lasted maybe 2 minutes before it simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the tree line that bordered our property. Dad grabbed me and practically carried me back to the house. Mom was making breakfast, and when we burst through the door, pale and shaking, she knew something was wrong. "Mary," Dad said to her, his voice trembling, "we need to talk." That night, after they thought I was asleep, I heard them discussing it in hushed voices. Dad wanted to call the police, but Mom reminded him how crazy it would sound. Besides, what could the police do? We had no proof, and the creature hadn't actually done anything threatening. That was the beginning of our family secret. Over the next few weeks, we tried to convince ourselves it was a one-time thing. Maybe it was just passing through. But then the incidents started happening regularly. We'd find massive footprints in the mud near the creek. The sheep would get spooked for no apparent reason. Sometimes at night, we'd hear heavy footsteps circling the house, and this odd whistling sound that wasn't quite human, but definitely wasn't an animal either. What really got to me was how it seemed to know our routines. It would often appear during morning chores, always keeping its distance but watching us intently, and it wasn't alone. By the end of that summer, we'd seen at least 3 different creatures of varying sizes. The largest one, which we started calling Big Jim, though never out loud, must have been close to 9 feet tall. They seemed particularly interested in the southeastern corner of our property, where an old Indian burial ground was located. We'd found arrowheads and pottery fragments there over the years. Dad had always left that area undisturbed out of respect, and now we had another reason to avoid it. The creatures never showed any aggression, but their presence was overwhelming. The way they moved, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. They could cover ground incredibly fast, and despite their size, they could be dead silent when they wanted to be. Sometimes the only way we knew they were around was the smell. this strong, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. One morning in late August, I was collecting eggs from the chicken coop when I heard something behind me. I turned around, and there was one of them, not 20 feet away. It was smaller than Big Jim, maybe 7 feet tall, with reddish-brown fur. What happened next still haunts me. It reached out and placed something on the ground. After it left, I found a perfectly preserved arrowhead, similar to the ones we'd found in the burial ground. As the years went by, we developed an unspoken understanding with them. They would keep their distance, and we would keep their secret. We never took pictures, though cameras weren't as common back then, never told anyone outside the family, and never tried to harm them. In return, they never harmed our livestock or approached too closely. They seemed to have patterns. They were more active in the early morning and late evening, less visible during the winter months, and would disappear completely during hunting season. They were intelligent, far more intelligent than any animal I've ever encountered. Sometimes when I was alone doing chores, I'd talk out loud, and I swear they understood what I was saying. The encounters continued throughout my childhood and into my adult years. Even after I went to college, I'd come home to help with the ranch, and they'd still be there. When I inherited the property after my parents passed, the creatures remained a constant presence. My own children grew up knowing about them, learning the same unspoken rules I had. But something changed in the winter of 2018. The encounters became less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. No footprints, no sounds at night, no mysterious arrowheads left as gifts. It was like they simply vanished, just as mysteriously as they had appeared all those years ago. The last time I saw one was on a cold December morning. I was bringing in firewood when I spotted Big Jim, or maybe one of his descendants, standing at the edge of the burial ground. He stood there for a long moment, looking right at me, then turned and walked into the trees. I never saw any sign of them again. I still run the ranch, though I've scaled back the operation considerably. Sometimes early in the morning when the mist rolls in from the mountains, I find myself looking for those massive silhouettes. My grandkids think I'm crazy when I tell them to be careful near the burial ground, but I know what I saw. I know what lived on this land with us for nearly 50 years. I'm not writing this to convince anyone or to seek validation. I'm writing it because I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to die with me. Whatever they were, Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, they were real. They lived here, they watched us, and in their own way, they communicated with us. The rational part of my brain still tries to make sense of it all. Why did they stay so long? What was so special about our land? Why did they finally leave? But I've learned that some questions don't have answers. Sometimes the mystery is all we get to keep. These days, when people ask me about running a ranch in Colorado, I just smile and tell them it's peaceful. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I catch that familiar musky scent on the breeze, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching from the shadows of the Spanish peaks, keeping their own secrets just as we kept theirs for so many years. Story 2. Back in 2013, we were living in this old farmhouse just outside Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Nothing fancy, just a 2-story house with a few acres of land backing up to the woods. Me, my wife Sarah, and our daughter Emma, who was 3 at the time. We'd moved there because the price was right, and I'd gotten a decent job at a manufacturing plant in Manchester. Sarah worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, so it was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and safe. At least that's what we thought. It started in late September, just little things at first. Emma had always been a good sleeper, but suddenly she started talking about her night friend. We thought it was just an imaginary friend phase, totally normal for a 3-year-old, right? She'd mention things like the big furry man who would say hi to her at night. We'd check her room, find nothing, and assume it was just her imagination running wild. But then things started getting weird, really weird. One night, I was up late watching TV after Sarah had gone to bed. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I heard this weird sound, like someone dragging their fingers across the side of the house. At first, I thought it was just branches in the wind, but there was something deliberate about it. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. When I went to check, I didn't see anything, but I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. You know that feeling when the hair stands up on the back of your neck? Yeah, that. A few nights later, Emma started getting excited about bedtime, which was unusual for her. "The furry man tells me stories," she said. "He's funny." Sarah and I were getting concerned at this point. We checked her room thoroughly, made sure all the windows were locked, even installed a baby monitor. But nothing showed up on it. Just Emma, sometimes talking and giggling to herself in the middle of the night. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I'd worked late. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to this sound, like something heavy walking around outside. Our bedroom was on the second floor, and the footsteps seemed to be circling the house. Heavy footsteps. Not like a person, more like, I don't know how to describe it, like someone really big walking very carefully. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, thinking it might be a bear. We'd had them in the area before, but when I looked out our bedroom window, what I saw, I still get chills thinking about it. There was this massive figure standing by Emma's window. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. The security light from the garage was creating this weird backlight effect, so I couldn't see details clearly, but I could see the outline. It was broad-shouldered, covered in what looked like dark fur, and it was standing there, perfectly still, looking into my daughter's window. I nearly dropped my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely type 911, but before I could hit call, the thing turned its head and looked right at me. I'm not exaggerating when I say its eyes reflected the light like a cat's, 2 reddish-orange points in the darkness. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it moved, faster than anything that big should be able to move, and disappeared into the woods. The police came, but of course they found nothing. Just some weird tracks in the mud under Emma's window, huge footprints, larger than any human foot, with 5 distinct toes. They took photos but basically told us it was probably just some prankster in a costume. Yeah, right. A prankster who could leave footprints that sank 2 inches into hard ground. The next day, I started really examining our property. What I found made my blood run cold. There were broken branches on trees, not at deer height, but 8 to 9 feet up. Places where something big had clearly been bedding down in the undergrowth at the edge of our property. And most disturbing of all, I found half-eaten apples from our apple tree scattered around, with teeth marks that were definitely not from a deer or bear. We tried to keep things normal for Emma's sake, but we were terrified. We started taking turns staying up at night. Sarah wanted to move immediately, but we couldn't afford to break our lease, so we installed security cameras, motion lights, the works. But here's the thing about these creatures. They're smart. The cameras would mysteriously stop working at certain times during the night. We'd check the footage in the morning and find hours of static. The knocking started about a week later. Not like someone knocking on the door, more like something tapping on the walls of the house. It would start around midnight and go on for hours. Tap, 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 moving around the house. Sometimes it would stop right outside Emma's room. We'd hear her giggling and talking, and when we'd rush in, she'd tell us her friend was just saying goodnight. One morning I found Emma's window open, just a crack, but I know for a fact we'd locked it the night before. That was it. We packed up essential items and went to stay with Sarah's parents in Massachusetts. When we came back 2 days later with some friends to pack up more of our stuff, we found this weird arrangement of sticks in the yard. Not random fallen branches, but deliberately placed in a pattern. My buddy Mike, who was helping us move, took one look at it and refused to help us pack anything else. The final straw came when we found handprints on Emma's window. Huge handprints, easily twice the size of mine, pressed into the dirt on the outside of the glass. They had distinct fingerprints, but they weren't human. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide. I took pictures, but they came out blurry, like every other piece of evidence we tried to document. We broke our lease and moved out the next day, lost our security deposit and had to pay a penalty, but I didn't care. No amount of money was worth risking my daughter's safety. We moved to a suburban neighborhood closer to Manchester, where the only woods are carefully maintained parks. Emma's 7 now, and she doesn't remember much about the furry man. Sometimes she'll say something that makes my blood run cold, like last month when we were camping in a designated campground with lots of other people around. She suddenly said, "It smells like my night friend." But mostly, she's just a normal kid. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened, looking for explanations that make sense. But I know what I saw. I know those footprints were real. I know something was watching my daughter, talking to her, trying to, I don't know what, make friends, lure her out. The thought still terrifies me. I've read other accounts since then, about Bigfoot being attracted to children, about them trying to communicate. Some people say they're peaceful, curious creatures. Maybe that's true. But when it's your child they're curious about, it doesn't matter how peaceful they might be. All that matters is keeping your family safe. We still live in New Hampshire, but I won't tell you where exactly. Sometimes I think about going back to that house, setting up cameras, trying to get proof. But then I remember those eyes reflecting in the darkness, that feeling of absolute helplessness as I watched this huge creature standing outside my daughter's window, and I know I never want to experience anything like that again. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in those woods. And I know that somewhere out there, in the forests of New Hampshire, something is watching, waiting, and maybe even trying to make friends with other children, just like it tried with Emma. The weirdest part? Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that tapping sound on our walls. Tap, tap, tap. Even though I know we're miles away from those woods, even though I know we're safe now, that sound still haunts me. Because deep down, I know that whatever that creature was, it's still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers us too. Story 3. It was January 12th, 2024. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, perfect for horseback riding, which was something my dad and I tried to do together whenever I visited Colorado. I'd moved to Chicago for work a few years ago, so these trips were precious to me. Dad keeps his horses at a small stable just outside St. Louis Valley, and we'd done this particular trail dozens of times before. We set out around 9 a.m. The temperature was hovering around 25 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Celsius, but we were dressed appropriately. Thermal underwear, thick wool socks, proper winter riding gear. There was about 8 inches of snow on the ground from a storm earlier that week, but the main trail was pretty well packed from other riders. The first 2 hours were completely normal. We talked about work, family stuff, my sister's upcoming wedding, just catching up like we always did. The horses, my dad's trusty quarter horse, Buck, and the stable's newer Arabian Cisco, which I usually rode, were behaving perfectly fine. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to when things started feeling different. It was around 11:30 a.m. when we reached the switchback that leads up to one of our favorite viewpoints. The sun was high, making the snow almost blindingly bright. That's when Cisco started acting strange. He kept tossing his head and shifting his weight, which wasn't like him at all. I remember thinking maybe he'd picked up on some wildlife, deer or elk, which weren't uncommon in the area. Dad was about 20 feet ahead of me on the trail when he suddenly pulled Buck to a stop. I didn't immediately understand why, but then I saw him slowly raising his arm to point at something on the ridge above us, maybe 200 yards away. My first thought was mountain lion. We'd seen them from a distance before, and while they usually avoided humans, it was always good to be aware of them. But what I saw when I followed his gesture wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Against the white snow and grey rock face, there was this figure. The thing that immediately struck me was its size. I've been around bears before, seen them both in the wild and at sanctuaries. This was different. It was clearly bipedal, and even from that distance I could tell it was massive, easily 9 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was crouched down, almost like it was trying to make itself smaller. But even in that position, its height was incredible. The creature was covered in dark fur, a deep brown that looked almost black against the snow. The fur seemed thick and matted in places, especially around what I assumed was its shoulders. Its arms, and I keep hesitating to use human terms to describe it, but that's what they were longer than they should be, with the hands or paws, I couldn't make out clear details at that distance, resting on the ground in front of it. What really got to me, what still haunts me, was how it was positioned. It wasn't just randomly there, it was watching us. The way it was crouched, the angle of what I assume was its head, everything about its posture screamed predator observing prey. I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable than I did in that moment. My dad whispered, "Do you see it moving?" His voice was tense in a way I'd never heard before. He's an experienced outdoorsman, someone who's dealt with all kinds of wildlife encounters, but this had him rattled. I couldn't see any movement. To me, the figure was completely still, like a statue carved out of dark stone. But my dad insisted it was swaying slightly, making these subtle adjustments to maintain its balance as it watched us. The fact that we were seeing it slightly differently made everything feel even more surreal. The horses were absolutely terrified. Cisco was trembling beneath me, making these small, distressed sounds I'd never heard from a horse before. Buck wasn't much better. He kept trying to back up, which I'd never seen him do before. These weren't inexperienced trail horses. They were well-trained animals that had encountered bears, mountain lions and moose without this level of panic. I wanted to grab my phone to take a picture. Everyone always asks why there isn't any photographic evidence when you tell these stories, but I honestly couldn't make myself move. It wasn't just fear, though I was definitely afraid. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing, couldn't give my muscles instructions on what to do. I just sat there staring, probably for no more than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Then my dad made a decision that probably saved us from whatever might have happened next. In a low, steady voice, he said, "We're going to turn around, nice and slow. Don't take your eyes off it until we're around the bend." The act of turning the horses was nerve-wracking. Cisco didn't want to expose his back to whatever was up there, and keeping him under control while trying to maintain visual contact with the creature required all my concentration. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the reins. As we slowly made our way back down the switchback, I kept looking over my shoulder. The figure remained in its position, but something about its stillness felt wrong. It wasn't the stillness of a creature trying not to be seen. It was the stillness of something absolutely confident in its position as an apex predator. We maintained a careful pace until we were around the bend and out of sight. That's when my dad said, "Now we ride, fast as is safe in this snow." We didn't need to discuss it further. We both knew we wanted as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The ride back to the stable was tense. We kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. Just the sound of hooves on snow and our own heavy breathing. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We both knew we'd seen something impossible. It wasn't until we were back at the stable, taking care of the horses, that we really discussed it. My dad, who I've never known to exaggerate or make up stories, was visibly shaken. He kept saying the way it moved wasn't natural, wasn't like any animal he'd ever encountered in his 40-plus years of outdoor experience. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what we saw. Could it have been a bear standing unusually, some kind of elaborate prank, a weird shadow or snow formation? But none of these explanations fit with what we both saw or with the horses' reactions. What really gets to me isn't just what we saw, it's the implications. If this thing is real, if it's out there in the Colorado wilderness, how has it remained hidden? How many are there? And why did it let us see it? These questions keep me up at night. I've gone back to Chicago now, back to my normal life of computer screens and office meetings, but I can't shake the memory of that figure on the ridge. Sometimes I dream about it, but in my dreams, it's not staying still, it's moving toward us with impossible speed. I wake up from these dreams drenched in sweat, grateful to be in my city apartment, far from the snowy trails of St. Louis Valley. My dad still rides those trails. He says he's not going to let one inexplicable experience change his whole life, but he doesn't go alone anymore, and he always carries a more powerful firearm than he used to. He hasn't seen the creature again, but he says sometimes when he's up on those higher trails, he gets the feeling he's being watched. I'm heading back to Colorado next month for my sister's wedding. Dad's already asked if I want to go riding, and I said yes. I'm not sure if I'm brave or stupid, but part of me needs to go back. Maybe to prove to myself that it was all somehow a mistake, a trick of light and shadow on a bright winter morning. But another part of me knows what I saw was real, and I can't decide if I'm more afraid of seeing it again, or never seeing it again, and having to live with this unexplainable experience for the rest of my life. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before that day, I would have nodded politely while thinking they were either lying or confused. But I know what I saw. My dad knows what he saw. And somewhere in the mountains around St. Louis Valley, something else knows what we saw too. Story 4. I should have stayed at the logging camp that night, but I was eager to get back to my small apartment in Orleans. My wife was visiting her sister in Sacramento, so I had no one expecting me, but something about those temporary camp beds never sat right with me. That decision to drive home haunts me to this day. The usual route along Highway 96 was closed due to a mudslide, so I had to take a detour near Bluff Creek. Even now, I can perfectly recall the sound of my '49 Ford's wipers struggling against the downpour, and that eerie feeling of being completely alone on that narrow dirt road with nothing but darkness beyond my headlights. The clock on my dashboard read 9:47 p.m. when it happened. I remember because I had just checked it, calculating how long it would take me to get home in this weather. My headlights caught something moving in the rain about 50 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was a bear. We had plenty of those in the area. But as I slowed down, I realized something was off about its shape. The thing was standing upright about my height. I'm 5'9", but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, and its body was covered in dark, matted fur that glistened in the rain. The head was what really got me. It reminded me of an orangutan I'd seen at a zoo once, but bigger, with a more pronounced brow. What happened next made my blood run cold. The creature turned to face my car, and I saw its eyes catch the headlights. They reflected back with an unnatural yellowish glow, like a cat's eyes but larger. And those teeth, I could see them clearly when it opened its mouth, especially the long canines that protruded past its lips. I hit the brakes, keeping about 30 feet between us. My first instinct was to reverse, but the road was too narrow, and with the rain, I worried about sliding into the ditch. The creature didn't run away like any normal animal would. Instead, it started moving toward my car with deliberate steps. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. The thing circled around to the driver's side, and I could hear its feet squishing in the mud. It was so close, I could see raindrops rolling off its fur. The smell hit me then, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I tried honking the horn, but that only seemed to agitate it. It slammed its hand against my window, leaving a muddy print that was clearly not human. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide. The window fogged up from its breath, and I could hear this deep, rumbling sound coming from its chest, almost like a growl, but lower. Every time I tried to inch the car forward, it would move to block my path. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I had my hunting rifle in the trunk, but there was no way I was getting out of that car. The worst part was when it crouched down to peer through my window. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't just reflecting light anymore. There was intelligence behind them. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I was running low on gas, and the engine's idle was the only sound besides the rain and that creature's occasional growls. I knew I had to do something. In desperation, I revved the engine hard and flashed my high beams repeatedly. The sudden noise and light seemed to startle it enough that it stepped back, just for a moment. That was my chance. I floored it, swerving around where it stood. The tires spun in the mud before finding grip. In my rearview mirror, I saw it chase after the car for about 50 yards, moving with an incredible speed that no human could match. Then it just stopped, standing there in the rain, watching me drive away. I didn't stop driving until I reached Orleans, and I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went to the local diner where all the loggers gathered, hoping to hear if anyone else had seen something similar. But before I could work up the courage to ask, I overheard two guys talking about how the road I'd taken was supposed to be closed due to washouts. According to them, no one had been through that way in days. I drove back out there later that day, in the safety of daylight and with a friend. We found the spot where it happened. There were unusual tracks in the dried mud, but the rain had distorted them too much to make out any clear details. The only concrete evidence was that handprint on my car window, but by the time I thought to photograph it, it had already been smeared by more rain. That happened 72 years ago, and I've never told many people about it. Who would believe me? I've read about other encounters in that area since then, especially after what they started calling the Bigfoot was filmed at Bluff Creek in 1967. But what I saw that night was different from the descriptions I've read. It wasn't some giant 8-foot-tall monster. It was smaller, more primitive-looking, more real. I'm an old man now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that night. I've never been able to explain it, and I've never seen anything like it again. But sometimes when it rains hard at night, I still check my windows, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. The weirdest part. A week after it happened, I was reading through some old logging reports at work, and I found surveys from the 1930s mentioning workers refusing to take jobs near Bluff Creek because of what they called devil monkeys in the area. The reports were filed away and forgotten, and I never found them again when I looked years later. Makes me wonder how long these things have really been out there, and how many other people have stories they're too afraid to tell. Story 5. I'm a lifelong hunter from central Wisconsin. Been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle, learned everything from my dad and grandfather. October 2016, I was doing some pre-season scouting near Medford, checking out new hunting grounds since my usual spot had been bought up by developers. I'd heard good things about the public land out there, lots of deer sign, not too crowded during season. It was a Tuesday morning, cloudy but dry, probably around 45 degrees. I'd taken the day off work specifically to scout because I knew the area would be empty. Left my house in Warsaw around 5:30 a.m., wanting to get there right as the sun came up. I remember checking my watch when I turned onto this narrow dirt road, 6:47 a.m. The road wasn't even marked on Google Maps, just this worn path cutting through thick forest. I'd been driving really slow, maybe 15 mph, scanning the tree line for deer trails and good spots to set up a stand. My window was cracked open so I could smell the air. Hunters know what I mean. You can smell deer if you know what you're looking for. The morning was dead quiet except for my truck's engine and some birds. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, something huge stepped out from the trees on the right side of the road. At first, my brain tried to make it make sense. Maybe a bear standing up, or a really tall person in a coat. But within seconds, I knew it wasn't either of those things. This thing was massive. I'm good with distances and measurements, been doing construction work for 20 years, and I'd estimate it was at least 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, shoulders impossibly wide. It was covered in this thick, shaggy hair that looked reddish-brown in the morning light, kind of like an Irish setter's coat, but darker in places. I took my foot off the gas and just let the truck coast to a stop, probably about 30 feet from where it was standing. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't have kept driving if I wanted to. The creature had stopped right in the middle of the road, and then it did something I'll never forget. It turned and looked directly at me. The face, God, the face. It wasn't a bear face or an ape face, but it wasn't human either. The eyes were set deep under a prominent brow, dark and intelligent looking. The nose was wide and flat, but not like a gorilla's, more human-like but bigger. No snout like a bear would have. Its mouth was closed, but I could see it was wider than a human mouth would be. We just stared at each other. I know it sounds crazy, but there was something so aware in those eyes. Not animal curiosity, but real intelligence. I couldn't move, couldn't reach for my phone to take a picture, which still haunts me. Couldn't even think about turning the truck around. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, looking into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. The whole encounter probably lasted about 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. I kept waiting for it to charge the truck or run away, but it did neither. Instead, it just calmly turned and walked into the woods on the left side of the road. Not running, not crashing through the underbrush like a spooked animal. Just walking, deliberate and almost graceful despite its size. The way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen. Each step was purposeful, its arms swinging naturally at its sides. Its head moved smoothly, not jerking around like a person in a costume would. The muscle movement under all that hair was visible. This wasn't some guy in a suit. The hair moved naturally with its body, and I could see the morning dew glistening on its back. After it disappeared into the trees, I sat there for probably another 5 minutes, just trying to process what I'd seen. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had this weird ringing in my ears, and I felt kind of sick to my stomach. The forest suddenly felt different, like when you're a kid and you realize there might actually be something in the dark. I'd love to tell you I jumped out of my truck and looked for footprints, or that I went crashing into the woods after it to get proof. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just sat there until I could breathe normally again, then turned my truck around and drove straight home. Called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day sitting in my garage, chain-smoking and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I've been back to that road a few times since then, always in broad daylight, always with someone else. Never saw anything like that again. Found some weird breaks in the trees where something big had pushed through, and once I found what might have been a footprint in some mud, but it had been partially filled with water, so I couldn't be sure. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size of it, or the way it moved, or even how human-like it was. It's those eyes. There was something in those eyes that recognized me as another thinking being. Not prey, not a threat, just another conscious creature. Sometimes I dream about those eyes, and I wake up feeling like I'm being watched. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I know. I've been a rational person my whole life. Never believed in anything supernatural, always laughed at those crazy Bigfoot shows on TV. But I know what I saw that morning. It was real, it was alive, and it was intelligent. I've told exactly 3 people about this: my wife, my best friend, and my dad. My wife believes me because she's never seen me as scared as I was that day. My best friend thinks I saw a bear, and my mind played tricks on me. My dad just listened quietly and then told me about something similar he'd seen in the UP back in the 70s, which honestly scared me more than my own encounter. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods. But something changed that day. The forests feel different now, like they're hiding something. Sometimes when I'm in my tree stand at dawn, I catch myself scanning the trees not for deer, but for a glimpse of reddish-brown hair or those intelligent eyes. Sometimes I think I hear heavy footsteps in the pre-dawn darkness, or catch a whiff of something musky and unfamiliar on the wind. I don't know what I saw that morning in Medford. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. What I do know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed how I see the world. There are things in our forests that we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm not selling a book or trying to get on TV. I just needed to tell someone who might understand, someone who might have seen something similar. Sometimes I wish I hadn't seen it, that I could go back to when the world made sense and the forests were just forests. But I can't unsee those eyes, can't unfeel that moment of connection with something that shouldn't exist. The rational part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Maybe it was the early morning light playing tricks. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe it really was just a bear. But deep down, I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm driving down a lonely forest road at dawn, I find myself slowing down and scanning the tree line, half hoping, half dreading that I'll see those eyes again. Story 6. That morning started like any other hunting trip. We got up around 3:30 a.m., loaded our gear into Dave's pickup, and headed out to our usual spot. The plan was to set up before sunrise to catch the early deer movement. The weather was perfect for hunting, crisp, clear, and cold enough to see your breath. There was a quarter moon out, giving us just enough light to move around without using our flashlights too much. We parked the truck at our usual spot around 4:30 a.m. and started getting our gear together. I remember checking my watch because I wanted to make sure we had enough time to get to our stands before first light. The woods were dead quiet. You know that special kind of silence you only get in the early morning hours when even the birds aren't awake yet. We were about to head out to our individual spots when it happened. At first it was just a feeling, that primal sensation that something isn't right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could tell by Mike and Dave's body language that they felt it too. Then we heard it. I've been hunting for over 20 years, and I've heard every animal sound you can imagine. Bears, mountain lions, elk, you name it. But this was different. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it grew into this massive, bone-chilling roar that literally made the ground beneath our feet vibrate. I'm not exaggerating. Our coffee cups in the truck bed were actually rattling. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was so powerful that I felt it in my chest cavity. Mike dropped his rifle case, and Dave, who's usually the tough guy of our group, let out a string of curses I won't repeat here. The roar lasted maybe 15-20 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then came the silence, but not the normal woods silence. This was different, heavier somehow. You could feel the tension in the air. We stood there, frozen, barely breathing, straining our eyes to see anything in the pre-dawn darkness. That's when we started hearing the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and incredibly heavy. Each step made a distinct thud that you could feel through the ground. Whatever it was big, way bigger than a bear. The footsteps were accompanied by the sound of breaking branches, not small twigs, but the kind of thick branches that would take considerable force to snap. The creature seemed to be moving in a semicircle around our position, staying just out of sight in the thick brush. The darkness played tricks on our eyes. Sometimes I thought I could see a massive shape moving through the trees, but when I tried to focus on it, it would disappear. The only thing we could make out clearly was the movement of the treetops as whatever it was pushed through the forest. None of us said a word. We just instinctively backed up closer to the truck. Dave reached inside and quietly grabbed his spotlight, but before he could turn it on, Mike grabbed his arm and shook his head. Something in our gut told us that we didn't want to provoke whatever was out there. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. Sometimes they'd get closer, and we'd hear branches breaking just 50 yards away. Other times they'd fade into the distance, only to circle back around. The whole time, there was this overwhelming sense of being watched, studied even. Around 5:30 a.m., things got even weirder. As the sky started to lighten slightly, we began hearing what I can only describe as deep, rhythmic breathing, like something massive taking slow, controlled breaths. It was coming from the tree line about 100 yards to our left. The sound had this strange quality to it, almost like it had a subsonic element that you felt more than heard. Then the smell hit us. I've heard people talk about Bigfoot smell before, and I always thought they were exaggerating. They weren't. It was this powerful, musky odor, like a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. As the morning got lighter, the activity seemed to increase. We could hear more movement in the brush, and twice more we heard that terrible roar, though not as loud as the first time. Each roar was followed by a series of wood knocks, not like woodpeckers, but like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. By this point, we were all sitting in the truck with the doors locked, watching the tree line. Our hands were shaking so bad we could barely hold our coffee cups. We kept seeing shadows moving between the trees, but the fog that had settled in made it impossible to make out any clear shapes. The sun finally started to rise around 7 a.m., and that's when things got really strange. The woods suddenly went completely silent. Not just the creature, but everything. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The fog started to lift, and for a brief moment, I saw something that I'll never forget. About 150 yards away, where the tree line met a small clearing, I saw a dark figure step partway out from behind a large oak tree. Even at that distance, I could tell it was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds before it stepped back behind the tree. But what struck me most was how smoothly it moved. There was something almost human-like about its movement, but at the same time completely alien. We sat there until almost 9 a.m., none of us willing to leave the safety of the truck. Eventually, the woods started to sound normal again. Birds began chirping. Squirrels started moving around. The oppressive feeling of being watched gradually lifted, and that horrible smell dissipated. When we finally got up the courage to step out of the truck, we found massive footprints in the soft ground near where we had been standing earlier. They were about 16 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever made them had to have been incredibly heavy. We also found several broken branches, some as thick as my arm, snapped like twigs. We didn't take any pictures of the footprints. Honestly, we were too shaken to think straight, and all we wanted to do was get out of there. We packed up and left immediately. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what had happened, but deep down, we all knew we had encountered something that shouldn't exist. I haven't been back to that spot since, and neither have Mike or Dave. We still hunt, but never in that area, and never alone. Sometimes when I'm in the woods now, I'll catch a whiff of that same musky smell, and my heart starts racing. I know there are people who won't believe this story, and that's fine. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't experienced it myself. What haunts me most isn't just what we encountered that morning, but the feeling that it was studying us, testing our reactions. It felt intelligent, deliberate in its actions. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I do know that it forever changed how I view the world. There are things out there that we can't explain, and sometimes it's better to just accept that and stay away. Story 7. I'd arranged to stay at this small cabin about half a mile from Big Reed Lake. The rental agent had warned me it was rustic, but I hadn't expected quite how isolated it would be. The dirt road leading to it was barely visible, and I had to double-check the coordinates several times in my rental car to make sure I wasn't lost. When I finally found it around 4 p.m., I remember thinking it looked exactly like what Americans would call a cabin in the woods, just a basic wooden structure with a small porch surrounded by towering pines and maples. The inside was simple but functional. One room with a bed, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a basic kitchen setup with a mini fridge and some cupboards. No electricity, just a gas lamp and a propane stove. The bathroom was an outhouse about 30 feet from the cabin. I'd brought enough supplies to last me 5 days, some canned goods, bread, snacks, and what I was most looking forward to, several nice thick steaks I'd picked up from a butcher in the last town I'd passed through. I also had a 12-pack of local craft beer I'd bought, thinking I'd treat myself to a cold one after fishing each day. I spent that first afternoon getting settled in and organizing my fishing gear. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-60s. I did some exploring around the cabin and walked down to check out the lake. The water was like glass, reflecting the dense forest surrounding it. I couldn't wait to get out there early the next morning. As evening approached, I fired up the propane stove and cooked myself a simple dinner of beans and bread. I'm not usually someone who gets spooked easily, but I have to admit, as darkness fell, the isolation started to get to me a bit. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional hooting of an owl or rustling in the trees. I kept the gas lamp on low and tried to distract myself by reading a fishing magazine I'd brought along. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in early since I wanted to be up before sunrise. I made sure everything was properly stored. I'd been warned about bears in the area, so I put my cooler with the steaks and beer on the porch rather than keeping it inside. In hindsight, that was probably my first mistake. I'd been asleep for a few hours when something woke me up. At first, I couldn't tell what had disturbed me, but then I heard it, heavy footsteps on the wooden porch. My first thought was, bear. But something felt off. The steps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They moved slowly across the porch, and I could hear the old boards creaking under significant weight. I lay there perfectly still, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. The footsteps stopped near where I'd left the cooler. There was a scraping sound, then a distinct thud, like something had picked up the cooler and set it down again. That's when the smell hit me. Even through the cabin's wooden walls, I caught a whiff of something I can only describe as a mix between wet dog and rotting vegetation. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I remember thinking no bear could smell like that. The next sound nearly made me jump out of my skin. The distinct crack of a beer can being opened, followed by what I can only describe as slurping sounds. Whatever was out there was drinking my beer. Under different circumstances, it might have been almost comical, but in that moment, I was terrified beyond belief. I had my mobile phone with me, but of course there was no signal. The rental agent had warned me about that. I did have a flashlight beside the bed, but I was too scared to turn it on. Instead, I just lay there, listening to this thing rummaging through my supplies. The creature seemed particularly interested in the food. I could hear it opening the cooler multiple times, accompanied by sounds of sniffing and what seemed like low, satisfied grunts. At one point, there was a loud crash that made me jump. I later discovered this was when it had knocked over a small side table I'd left on the porch. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The thing started moving around the cabin, as if inspecting it. I could hear it brushing against the walls, its heavy breathing clearly audible in the night silence. It paused at each window, and though I couldn't see anything in the darkness, I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. When it reached the window nearest my bed, I heard what I can only describe as sniffing sounds, loud, deliberate inhalations. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't a growl exactly. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like a very low human humming, but with an animalistic quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. Eventually, the footsteps moved away from the cabin, accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged, my cooler, as I later discovered. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. I just lay there, straining my ears for any sign that it might come back. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally gathered the courage to get up and look outside. The porch looked like it had been hit by a small tornado. The side table was overturned, and there was food scattered everywhere. But what really caught my attention was the potato salad. I'd had a large container of it in the cooler, and it was now spread across the wooden boards of the porch. And in that mess, I could see something that made my stomach drop: partial footprints. These weren't bear tracks. They were too large, too human-like. But they weren't human either. The size alone ruled that out. They were massive, probably 15 inches long from what I could tell, though it was hard to get exact measurements since they were just partial impressions in the potato salad. My cooler was nowhere to be seen. I later found it about 50 yards into the woods, completely empty. All 4 steaks were gone, along with most of my beer. Whatever had visited me had apparently enjoyed quite a feast. I spent about an hour documenting everything with my camera: the tracks, the mess, the damage to the porch. Then I packed up my stuff and got the hell out of there. I didn't even stick around to try fishing. I drove straight back to the nearest town and spent the rest of my vacation in a motel. I filed a report with the local ranger station, but I could tell they didn't take it too seriously. They suggested it was probably a black bear, despite my insistence about the footprints and the other details that didn't add up. The rental agent just shrugged it off, saying, "Weird things happen in those woods sometimes." That was 22 years ago, and I've never gone back to Maine. I still fish, but I stick to more populated areas now. I've read about other encounters people have had in those woods, and while I'm not saying I know exactly what visited me that night, I'm certain of one thing: it wasn't a bear. Whatever it was seemed almost purposeful in its actions. The way it inspected the cabin, the fact that it opened beer cans, the almost human-like qualities of its movement. It all suggests something far more intelligent than your average wildlife. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer, tried to gather more evidence. But honestly, the terror I felt that night was unlike anything I've experienced before or since. The isolation, the darkness, the unknown nature of what was out there, it all combined into something that went beyond normal fear. The smell is what stays with me the most. Even now, 2 decades later, I sometimes catch a whiff of something that reminds me of it, and my heart starts racing. It's not something you forget. That distinct, powerful odor that seemed to mark something both animal and yet not quite animal at the same time. I still have the photos somewhere, though they don't show much, just the mess on the porch and those partial footprints in the potato salad. But I don't need photos to remember what happened. That night is permanently etched in my memory, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy our normal explanations. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before that night, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But when you experience something like this firsthand, it changes your perspective. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened to me on that terrifying night in the Maine wilderness. Make of it what you will. Story 8. I was 34 at the time, taking a solo RV trip through Northern California. I'd recently gone through a divorce and needed to clear my head, so I decided to spend a few weeks exploring the Pacific Northwest in my 26-foot Winnebago. Everything was going fine until I reached Mount Shasta. I'd found this small RV park just outside the town limits. It wasn't anything fancy, just a gravel lot with some basic hookups and about a dozen other RVs scattered around. The mountain loomed over everything, and the whole place was surrounded by dense forest. During the day, it was actually pretty peaceful. But that night, God, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard the noise. I'm a light sleeper anyway, and the sound of something rustling through trash immediately caught my attention. At first, I figured it was probably a bear. We'd been warned about them at check-in, and I'd made sure to properly store my food. But something about the sound seemed off. The movements were too deliberate, too careful. I got up and peeked through my RV's side window. The park had these dim, solar-powered lights scattered around, casting everything in this eerie, bluish glow. What I saw next to the dumpsters made my blood run cold. It was huge, like impossibly huge, standing at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The thing was covered in dark, matted fur, and it was methodically going through the garbage, picking through it with these massive hands that looked almost human-like. Its movements were smooth, calculated, nothing like a bear's clumsy pawing. I know this sounds crazy, but my first instinct wasn't to run or hide. Instead, I had this overwhelming urge to document what I was seeing. I had my phone, but this was 2005. Phone cameras were awful, especially at night. Then I remembered something I'd read online about Bigfoot researchers always trying to get hair samples for DNA testing. Looking back, I can't believe how stupid I was. I grabbed a pair of scissors from my kitchen drawer and my flashlight. My plan, and I cringe thinking about how naive this was to try to sneak up close enough to clip a small piece of fur while it was distracted with the trash. I figured if it was focused on eating, I might have a chance. I quietly opened my RV door, trying to keep my breathing steady. The thing was about 50 feet away, still completely absorbed in its foraging. I started inching closer, keeping to the shadows between the RVs. The whole time, my heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it would hear it. I got within maybe 20 feet when everything went to hell. I must have kicked a piece of gravel or something, because suddenly the creature's head snapped up. For a split second our eyes met, and what I saw wasn't animal at all. There was intelligence there, and now pure rage. It let out this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, something that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. I dropped both the scissors and flashlight and ran for my life. Those 50 feet back to my RV felt like 50 miles. I could hear it coming after me, its footsteps shaking the ground. I practically dove through my RV door, slamming it shut and fumbling with the lock. I scrambled to the driver's seat, thinking maybe I could start the engine and get out of there. That's when the first impact hit. The whole RV rocked violently as something massive slammed into the side. I was thrown against the steering wheel. Then another hit from the other side. It was testing the RV, looking for weak points. I could hear its heavy breathing and what sounded like frustrated grunts. The attacks continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Each impact was accompanied by this terrible scraping sound, its claws or hands dragging across the metal exterior. At one point, it actually started shaking the entire vehicle back and forth. I was sure the RV was going to tip over. I was curled up in the front seat, too terrified to move or make a sound. The windows were covered with condensation from my panicked breathing, and I couldn't see out. That somehow made it worse, not knowing exactly where it was or what it was doing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The attacks stopped. I could hear footsteps moving away, heavy but getting fainter. Still, I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was until the sun came up, maybe 4 hours later. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, the damage was obvious. There were deep scratches all along both sides of the RV, and one of the exterior storage compartments had been completely crushed. The dumpster area was a mess, with trash scattered everywhere. But the most chilling thing was the footprints. They were everywhere in the gravel, huge, human-like prints that must have been at least 16 inches long. I took pictures of them with my phone, but they came out terrible in the early morning light. By the time I thought to try measuring them or making casts, the park manager had already started cleaning up the mess. I tried to tell him what happened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He blamed it on a bear, even though we both knew bears don't leave footprints like that. When I showed him the damage to my RV, he just shrugged and said I should have better insurance. I packed up and left that morning, drove straight through to Oregon without stopping. I've never gone back to Mount Shasta, and I've never gone camping or RVing alone again. The scratches on my RV were a constant reminder until I finally sold it a year later. I couldn't stand looking at them anymore. Here's the thing that still haunts me, that look in its eyes. It wasn't just angry that I was trying to get close. It knew what I was trying to do. There was recognition there, understanding. Whatever I saw that night wasn't just some animal. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist but does. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the lack of sleep and stress from my divorce had made me hallucinate. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those eyes, they were too human. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear that sound it made, that horrible scream that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I experienced that night was real. And if you're ever camping near Mount Shasta, especially alone, please be careful. Some things out there are better left undisturbed. Story 9. I've lived on this 40-acre property for almost 15 years now. It's pretty isolated, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with the closest neighbor about 2 miles down the road. I keep horses, some chickens, and 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a blue heeler called Maya. They've always been great watchdogs, alerting me to any coyotes or mountain lions that occasionally pass through. That morning started like any other. I got up at 5:30 a.m. to feed the horses and let the chickens out. It was mid-July, and the air was crisp with that characteristic mountain morning chill. I noticed something was off right away. The horses were acting strange. huddled together in the corner of their paddock instead of coming up to the fence for breakfast like they usually do. Duke and Maya were also unusually quiet, staying close to my legs instead of running around the property like normal. I chalked it up to maybe a mountain lion passing through during the night. We get them occasionally, and the animals always sense them before I do. I'd actually set up some trail cameras around the property a few months back after finding some unusual tracks that were too big for a mountain lion. I figured they might help me keep an eye on predators around the farm. The weird feeling continued all morning. While cleaning the stables, I kept getting this sensation of being watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? Yeah, that. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the usual view of the forest edge about 100 yards from the barn. Around noon, I was bringing in hay from the storage shed when I heard it. A sound I still can't properly explain. It was like a cross between a deep growl and what I can only describe as wood creaking under immense pressure. It came from the tree line, and it was loud. Both dogs immediately froze, their ears perked up, but instead of barking or running toward the sound like they usually would with wildlife, they both slunk behind me, tails tucked. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 50 yards from where I stood, partially obscured by a large pine tree, was this massive grayish figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. But what struck me most was how it moved, not like a bear standing up, but with this fluid, almost human-like motion. It stepped slightly out from behind the tree, and I could see its face. God, that face! It was like a primitive human face, but not quite. The brow ridge was prominent, and its eyes, they were dark but intelligent-looking. I stood there, completely frozen, hay still in my arms. The creature and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it did something that still gives me nightmares. It deliberately raised its arm and placed it against the trunk of the pine tree, almost like it was marking territory. Its hand was massive, with long fingers that seemed too dexterous for what you'd expect from a wild animal. The horses started going crazy in their paddock, whinnying and running back and forth. The creature's head snapped in their direction, and in that moment of distraction, I dropped the hay and ran for the barn, dogs right behind me. Inside, my hands shaking, I grabbed my phone to call. Who? The police. What would I even say? But that wasn't even the strangest part of that day. As I was peering out the barn window, trying to get another look at the creature, I saw movement from a different direction. From the eastern tree line, this enormous cat-like animal emerged. When I say enormous, I mean it was easily the size of a mountain lion, but built differently, bulkier, with a slightly different head shape. Its fur had this weird pattern I'd never seen before. What happened next was the most surreal thing I've ever witnessed. The cat-like creature seemed to notice the grey figure, and they both just stared at each other. There was this palpable tension in the air. The grey figure made that weird wood-creaking sound again, and the cat-like creature responded with a low growl that I could feel in my chest, even from inside the barn. For about 10 minutes, these two creatures seemed to be in some kind of standoff. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they both slowly backed away into their respective sections of the forest. The grey figure disappeared first, moving with surprising stealth for something so large. The cat-like creature remained at the tree line for a few more minutes before it too vanished into the trees. I stayed in the barn for at least another hour, my dogs pressed against me, before I worked up the courage to make a run for the house. Once inside, I immediately went to check my trail cameras. Most of them showed nothing unusual, but one, the one facing the eastern tree line, had captured something. The images were grainy and partially obscured by branches, but they showed enough. There was one photo of the grey figure, though it was mostly in shadow. You could make out its basic shape and height, but not much detail. The cat-like creature was clearer in another photo, and it looked even more bizarre in the image than it had in person. I spent the rest of that day inside, watching through my windows. The horses eventually calmed down, but they stayed huddled together. My dogs refused to go outside without me, even to do their business. As night fell, I heard more strange sounds from the forest. Wood knocking, that weird creaking sound again, and what sounded like heavy footsteps. The next morning, I went out to check the property. Near the pine tree where the grey figure had stood, I found impressions in the ground that looked like massive footprints, easily 16 inches long. There were also deep claw marks on the tree trunk, about 8 feet up, much higher than any bear could reach. On the eastern side of the property, I found large cat-like prints, but they were unlike any mountain lion tracks I'd ever seen. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally heard strange sounds at night, and my animals would sometimes act nervous, but I never saw either creature again that clearly. I did catch glimpses of movement in the trees, and my trail cameras captured a few more grainy images, but nothing as clear as that day. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to make sense of what I saw. The grey figure matched descriptions of what people call Bigfoot, but I'd never heard of one being greyish in colour, and that cat-like creature. I still can't find anything that quite matches what I saw. I've thought about selling the property and moving, but this is my home. The creatures, whatever they were, never showed any aggressive behaviour toward me or my animals. It was more like they were establishing boundaries, or maybe just curious. Still, I've installed more security lights around the property, and I keep my trail cameras running constantly. Sometimes I wake up at night, hearing that wood creaking sound in my dreams, and I wonder if anyone would believe me if I hadn't captured those photos. I still have them, though they're not as clear as I'd like. Mostly shadows and silhouettes that make you question what you're looking at. But I know what I saw that day. I know it was real. The strangest part is how normal everything seems now. Life went back to its regular rhythm, almost like that day never happened. But every morning when I go out to feed the horses, I catch myself looking at that pine tree, and sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the forest. My dogs still won't go near certain parts of the property, and the horses get skittish for no apparent reason. It's like the land itself remembers what happened, even if it never shows itself that clearly again. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else in the La Garita area has experienced anything similar. These creatures are out there, moving through our forests, living their own lives parallel to ours. I don't know what they are or why they chose to reveal themselves to me that day, but I know what I saw, and I know that our understanding of what exists in this world is far from complete. Story 10. I've held on to this story for over 70 years now, and my hands still shake when I think about what happened that cold autumn morning in Lake Placid. I was 65 then, recently retired from my position as a minister, and had moved to a modest house near the power plant. The events I'm about to share changed my understanding of what exists in our world forever. It started simply enough. I'd noticed signs of someone living in the woods behind my property, disturbed areas in the undergrowth, unusual arrangements of branches, that sort of thing. Having worked with the homeless during my ministry, I felt called to help. I began leaving out sandwiches and canned goods on my back porch, just basic stuff really, nothing fancy. Peanut butter sandwiches, soup cans, apples. They'd always disappear overnight. This went on for about 2 months before things got strange. I started finding gifts. Not your usual items, mind you. Peculiarly shaped stones, some with fascinating natural patterns. Branches twisted into odd shapes I couldn't quite figure out. At first I assumed it was just my homeless friend showing gratitude, But something felt off about these items. They were arranged too precisely, too deliberately. Then came that October morning in '52. I remember it clear as day because it was my late wife Martha's birthday, and I'd been up early dealing with my arthritis acting up. The sun hadn't even risen yet, but there was enough pre-dawn light to see by. I was sitting on my back porch with my morning coffee, wrapped in my old wool sweater against the cold, when I noticed something different about the tree line. The air felt heavy, like just before a storm, but the sky was clear. There was this smell, not unpleasant, but wild, like wet earth and something else I couldn't place. The birds had gone quiet, which I noticed because they usually made such a racket at dawn. That's when I saw the arrangement. Someone, something, had created an elaborate pattern with stones and branches right at the edge of my property, maybe 50 feet from where I sat. It wasn't there the evening before, I'm certain of it. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern, with the branches pointing toward my house like arrows. In the center was one of my empty soup cans from the previous week's offerings. My hands were trembling so badly I put my coffee cup down. That's when I heard it, a deep, wood-knocking sound from the forest. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. I've heard woodpeckers all my life, but this was different. This was deliberate. This was communication. Fighting every instinct telling me to go back inside, I stood up. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the morning air. "I'm Ted. I've been leaving you food." The silence that followed was deafening. Then something moved in the tree line. I couldn't make out a clear shape, but what I saw still haunts me. It was tall, far taller than any man I've ever met. The movement was smooth but powerful, like a shadow flowing between the trees. I caught a glimpse of what looked like dark, matted fur, but my mind couldn't quite process what I was seeing. Then it stepped partially into view, staying half hidden behind a massive pine tree. God help me, it must have been at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its head seemed somewhat pointed, not round like a human's. I could make out 2 eyes reflecting the dim light, set deep in a face that seemed both ape-like and disturbingly human. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature raised one massive hand, I could see it clearly, and placed something on a low branch. Then it backed away, moving with an agility that seemed impossible for something its size. Several minutes passed before I found the courage to move. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward that branch. There, balanced carefully, was a perfect cross made of twigs, bound together with some kind of plant fiber. Next to it was a smooth black stone shaped, remarkably like a heart. I reached out with trembling fingers and touched the cross. The craftsmanship was incredible. No human tools could have achieved such precision with simple twigs. As I picked it up, that wood-knocking sound came again, this time from deeper in the forest. 3 knocks, just like before. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were partially hidden under fallen leaves, but what I saw turned my blood to ice. They were bare footprints, human-like but massive, pressing deep into the soil. I wear a size 11 shoe, and these prints were easily twice that size. I backed away slowly, clutching the cross and stone. When I reached my porch, I heard movement in the forest again, branches cracking, undergrowth rustling, but this time it was moving away, deeper into the woods. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, alternating between staring at the gifts and watching the tree line. The creature never returned that day, but I knew it was still out there. I could feel its presence, like a weight in the air. That night, I left out twice the usual amount of food, adding some fresh fruit and nuts I had in my pantry. By morning it was gone, replaced by another arrangement of stones, this time in a perfect circle with a single pine cone in the center. These exchanges continued for months, each one more elaborate than the last. But I never again saw the creature as clearly as I did that October morning. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'd hear those three distinct knocks from the forest, like it was letting me know it was still there, still watching. I've thought long and hard about why it chose to reveal itself to me that day. Was it because I was a man of faith? Was it lonely? Was it trying to tell me something? I'll never know. The encounters gradually became less frequent, and by the spring of '53, they stopped altogether. I still have every gift it left me, the crosses, the stones, even some of the more intricate branch arrangements. They're stored in a box in my attic now. Sometimes when my grandchildren visit, they ask to see them, but I always decline. How could I explain what really happened? I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen the blurry photographs and heard the second-hand accounts, but none of them capture what I experienced. This wasn't just some animal. There was intelligence in those eyes, purpose in those gifts. It understood symbolism, the cross, the heart-shaped stone. It was trying to communicate something profound. Even now, decades later, I sometimes sit on my porch at dawn, coffee in hand, and watch the tree line. The knocking never comes anymore, but I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know that deep in the forests around Lake Placid, there are things that defy our understanding of what's possible. I've never shared this story publicly before. Who would believe a retired minister's tale of leaving food for Bigfoot? But I know what I experienced. Those gifts, those footprints, that impossible figure in the dawn light, they were real. They are real. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings, I could swear I still smell that distinct wild scent on the breeze, like a reminder that there are mysteries in this world far beyond our comprehension. Some people have suggested I imagined it all, that age and loneliness played tricks on my mind. But I still have those gifts, those perfect, impossible gifts that no human hands could have crafted. And sometimes that's all the proof I need to know that what I experienced was real, even if I'll never fully understand what it was or why it chose to reveal itself to me. Story 11. It was early October 1998, and I was part of the Maine Ornithological Society. Every autumn, we'd organize bird-watching trips to track the fall migration. That year, 6 of us planned a day trip to Acadia to observe the hawk migration along the coast. The group included myself, 2 retired couples, Tom and Martha, Bob and Linda, and Sarah, a graduate student studying ornithology at the University of Maine. We met at the park entrance around 6:30 a.m. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for birding. We had our usual gear, binoculars, cameras, field guides, and enough supplies for a full day of hiking. I remember being excited because we'd heard reports of some rare species passing through the area. The first few hours were completely normal. We followed the precipice trail, stopping occasionally to observe chickadees, nuthatches, and a few early migrating hawks. The conversation was light, mostly about recent bird sightings and identifying calls. Around 10 a.m., we reached a more secluded area of the trail, where it opens up to some impressive cliff faces. That's when things started getting weird. First, we noticed an unusual silence. If you're into birding, you know that sudden quiet usually means something's wrong, predator nearby, that sort of thing. But this was different. It felt heavier somehow, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Sarah noticed it first. "Guys," she whispered, "do you hear that?" We all stopped. At first I didn't hear anything, but then I caught it. A deep, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but much too loud to be from any animal I knew. It seemed to be coming from above us. I raised my binoculars to scan the cliff face, more out of habit than anything else. That's when I saw it, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. About 200 feet up, partially hidden behind some scrub pine, was something that shouldn't exist. something that couldn't exist. Through my Swarovski 10x42s, I remember the exact specs because I've replayed this moment in my head thousands of times. I could see a massive figure. It was crouched down, but even in that position, I estimated it had to be at least 15-20 feet tall. The thing was covered in thick, grayish-brown hair, but it wasn't uniform like a bear's fur. It had patches of darker and lighter coloring, almost like a pattern. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the binoculars steady, but I forced myself to keep looking. Its face. God, its face. It was disturbingly human-like, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. The eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow ridge, and its nose was wide and flat. But what really got to me were its hands. They were massive, easily twice the size of a human hand, with visible wrinkles in the palms. The fingers were long and surprisingly delicate-looking for something so huge. I must have made some sort of noise because Martha whispered, "What do you see?" I couldn't speak. I just handed her my binoculars, my hands trembling. She took one look and gasped, which caused the creature to suddenly turn its head in our direction. That's when true panic set in. The thing's eyes. I could see intelligence in them. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that understood it was being watched. For a split second, our eyes met through the binoculars, and I felt this overwhelming sense of fear. Not my fear, though I was terrified, but its fear. It was afraid of us. What happened next is still burned into my memory. The creature stood up to its full height, and Jesus, it was even bigger than I'd thought, and moved with incredible speed. For something that size, it shouldn't have been able to move like that. In 3 massive strides, it covered about 50 feet of cliff face, using handholds I couldn't even see. Then it just disappeared into the tree line above. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. After it vanished, we all just stood there in shocked silence. Linda was crying quietly. Bob had his arm around her, but he was pale as a sheet. Tom had dropped his camera and was just staring up at where the creature had been. Sarah was the first to speak. "We need to document this," she said, her voice shaking. She pulled out her field notebook and started writing frantically. I remember thinking how surreal it was, like we were recording just another bird sighting, except this time it was something that would shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about the world. We tried to take photos of the area where we'd seen it, but from our angle they just showed the cliff face. We found some broken branches where it had disappeared into the trees, but nothing else. No footprints, no hair samples, nothing. It was like it had never been there. We cut our trip short and headed back down the trail. Nobody wanted to stay up there any longer than necessary. The walk back was tense. Every snapping twig made us jump. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that massive figure following us. When we reached the parking lot, we tried to decide what to do. Should we report it? To whom? The park rangers? The police? Who would believe us? We were all respected members of the birding community. Tom was even a retired biology professor. We had reputations to consider. In the end, we agreed to keep it to ourselves. Sarah was reluctant. She wanted to go public with what we'd seen, but eventually agreed that without evidence, we'd just be dismissed as crackpots. We swore to each other we wouldn't talk about it, but we also promised to document everything we could remember separately, in case we ever decided to come forward. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those eyes. I kept thinking about how it had looked afraid. Why would something that size, something that powerful, be afraid of us? That detail has haunted me more than anything else. Over the years, I've gone back to Acadia dozens of times, always hoping to see it again, always carrying a better camera. I've never seen anything like it since. The others haven't either. We still keep in touch, bound by this secret we share. Tom passed away last year, and at his funeral, Martha pulled me aside and asked if I ever think about that day. We all do. How could we not? I'm sharing this now because I recently read about similar sightings in the area, and I feel guilty for staying quiet all these years. Maybe if we had come forward then, there would be more research, more attempts to understand what's out there. But I also know why we didn't. It's easy to judge until you're faced with something that challenges everything you believe about the world. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I do. I've spent 26 years trying to convince myself there must be some other explanation for what we saw. But I know what I saw through those binoculars. 6 people, educated, rational people who spent their lives studying and observing nature, all saw the same thing. We couldn't all have been hallucinating. Sometimes when I'm bird watching, I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second I'll think it's back. My heart will race, and I'll feel that same mix of terror and awe I felt that day. It never is, of course. But I can't help wondering where it is now, what it is, and if it remembers us too. The rational part of my brain still struggles with this. I'm a person of science, someone who believes in evidence and facts. But I also know what I saw that day was real. It was as real as the keyboard I'm typing on now, as real as the birds I've spent my life studying. And somewhere out there, in the forests of Maine, there's something that defies everything we think we know about the natural world. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I needed to tell this story. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar and is afraid to come forward. Maybe knowing they're not alone will help them find the courage to share their story too. One final note. If you're ever hiking in Acadia, especially around the Precipice Trail, and you notice that sudden, heavy silence, maybe don't look up. Some things can't be unseen, and some knowledge changes you forever. I haven't been able to look at the world the same way since that October morning in 1998, and sometimes I wish I could go back to not knowing what I know now. But then I remember those eyes, that moment of connection with something that shouldn't exist, and I realize that even with all the sleepless nights and unanswered questions, I wouldn't change what happened. It showed me that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, and maybe that's not such a bad thing to know. Story 12. I was 27 at the time, working as a surveyor, and I'd gotten pretty comfortable with solo camping trips. That weekend in late September, I'd driven up to a remote area near Mount Robson Provincial Park. The weather forecast was decent, cool but dry, perfect for what I'd planned as a 3-day hiking and camping trip. I'd done this kind of thing dozens of times before, so I wasn't particularly worried about being alone. I found a nice spot to set up camp about 2 miles off the main trail, in a small clearing surrounded by towering western red cedars. It was far enough from the usual tourist spots that I figured I'd have some peace and quiet. The clearing had a natural dip that provided some shelter from the wind, and there was a small stream about 50 yards away. Perfect spot, or so I thought. The day went normally enough. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking and taking photos of the landscape. The fall colors were stunning, all those yellow and orange leaves against the dark green of the conifers. I remember feeling so at peace, just listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. As evening approached, I got my camp set up for the night. I had my 2-person tent. I always brought a bigger tent for the extra space, my camping stove, some freeze-dried meals, and my other gear spread out nearby. I'd brought a good amount of equipment since I was planning to do some surveying work while I was out there. My theodolite, maps, and various measuring tools were carefully packed in their cases. The sun set around 7:30 p.m., and I had my dinner by the campfire, just enjoying the solitude. The temperature dropped pretty quickly once it got dark, so I put on my heavy fleece jacket. I remember checking my watch around 9 p.m. and thinking about turning in early. That's when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet you get at night, but an absolute silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that when everything goes quiet, it usually means there's a predator around. I figured it might be a bear or a cougar, so I made sure my bear spray was within reach and added more wood to the fire. But something felt different about this silence. It felt deliberate. The first sign that this wasn't a normal wildlife encounter came around 9:30 p.m. I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the forest, but they were coming from multiple directions. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy, much heavier than a black bear or even a grizzly. And they were bipedal, distinctly bipedal. My first thought was that maybe some other hikers had gotten lost and were approaching my camp. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The footsteps were too heavy, too spread out, and there was something about the rhythm that just wasn't human. That's when I saw the first one. It emerged from the tree line about 40 yards from my camp, and I immediately froze. Even in the dim light from my campfire, I could make out its massive size. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick dark fur that looked black in some places and grayish in others. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. It stood completely upright on two legs, with arms that hung down past its knees. Before I could even process what I was seeing, a second one appeared to my left, then a third, and a fourth. They were all similar in size and coloring, moving with an eerie sort of grace that seemed impossible for creatures so large. They spread out around the perimeter of my camp, staying just at the edge of the firelight. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. Every survival instinct was screaming at me to run, but I knew that would be suicide. These things could cover ground faster than any human, and in the dark forest, I wouldn't stand a chance. So I sat there, trying to make myself as small and non-threatening as possible, as these creatures began to methodically move closer to my camp. They maintained a kind of formation, keeping roughly equal distances from each other as they approached. What struck me was how coordinated they seemed. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was clearly planned and organized. The creatures communicated with each other using a series of low grunts and clicking sounds that I can only describe as similar to what a dolphin might make, but deeper and more guttural. It wasn't random noise. There was a clear pattern to it, like they were having a conversation I couldn't understand. One of them, the largest, I think, approached my equipment cases. With shocking dexterity, it picked up my theodolite case and turned it over in its massive hands, examining it from different angles. Its fingers were huge, but surprisingly nimble, and it handled the equipment with what seemed like genuine curiosity. That's when I noticed the fifth one. It was smaller than the others, maybe 8 feet tall, and it moved differently, more cautiously. It emerged from the trees behind the others and made a series of rapid clicking sounds. The larger ones responded with low grunts, and the small one approached my tent. I watched, barely breathing, as it carefully unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. The intelligence in its movements was undeniable. It wasn't ripping or tearing like an animal would. It was using the zipper exactly as a human would. It pulled out my sleeping bag and held it up, making more of those clicking sounds to the others. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The creature with my theodolite turned its head and looked directly at me. In the firelight, I could see its face clearly for the first time. It had deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, and a powerful jaw. But it was the eyes that got me. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was intelligence there, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It took a step toward me, still holding my theodolite case. I could smell it now, a strong, musky odor that wasn't entirely unpleasant, but was definitely alien. It made a low sound, almost like a rumble, and tilted its head slightly as it studied me. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stared at each other. I didn't dare move. I could hear the others moving around my camp, picking things up and putting them down, but I couldn't take my eyes off the one in front of me. Then, without warning, it placed my theodolite case carefully, almost gently, back where it had found it. It made a series of loud clicks, and the others immediately responded. They began to back away from the camp, moving with that same coordinated precision they'd shown when approaching. The small one was the last to leave. It placed my sleeping bag back in the tent and even tried to zip the flap closed, though it didn't quite manage to close it completely. Then it turned and looked at me for a moment before following the others into the darkness. I sat there for what must have been another hour, not daring to move, straining my ears for any sound of their return. Gradually, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest returned, the crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. When dawn finally came, I broke camp faster than I ever have in my life. Everything was exactly where they'd left it. Nothing was broken or damaged. The only evidence that anything had happened were the massive footprints in the soft earth around my camp, footprints that were over 20 inches long and showed clear dermal ridges like giant human fingerprints. I took photos of the footprints, but in my panic and rush to leave, most of them came out blurry and unusable. I still have one clear photo, though I rarely show it to anyone. Not because I'm worried about being ridiculed, I'm long past caring about that, but because that night changed something fundamental in how I see the world, and I'm not always sure others are ready for that change. I've never gone camping alone since then. I've done a lot of research over the years, trying to find similar encounters, and while I've found some, none quite match what I experienced. The level of intelligence and coordination I witnessed that night suggests something far beyond what most people imagine when they think of Bigfoot. These weren't just animals. They weren't just undiscovered primates. They were something else entirely, something that seemed to exist in that gray area between human and non-human intelligence. The way they handled my equipment, the way they communicated with each other, the curiosity they showed, it all pointed to a level of sophistication that I still struggle to comprehend. Sometimes late at night I find myself thinking about that moment when the large one looked into my eyes. There was recognition there, not just of me as another living being, but of me as something it understood. And maybe that's what scares me the most. Not that there are unknown creatures in our forests, but that they might understand us far better than we understand them. I still go hiking and camping, but never in that area, and never alone. I've thought about going back, about trying to find them again, but something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the understanding that some encounters are meant to be unique, moments that challenge our understanding of the world and leave us questioning everything we thought we knew. What I experienced that night in British Columbia wasn't just a Bigfoot sighting. It was a glimpse into something larger, something that makes me question our place in the natural world. These creatures, whatever they are, share our world but exist just beyond the edge of our understanding. And maybe that's where they belong, in that shadowy space between what we know and what we fear to know. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, and honestly, that's not why I'm sharing it. I'm sharing it because for 30 years I've carried this experience with me, and sometimes the weight of it feels too heavy to bear alone. I know what I saw that night. I know it was real. And I know that somewhere in the forests of British Columbia there are creatures that challenge everything we think we know about what's possible. Story 13. I'd saved up for months to book this remote fishing expedition to Big Reed Lake in Hancock, Maine. The travel agent had warned me about bears and moose, but I wasn't too concerned. I'd done my research and packed accordingly. Bear spray, air horn, the works. What I wasn't prepared for was, well, I'm still not entirely sure what it was. The flight in was spectacular. The bush pilot, Mike, was a chatty fellow who'd been flying these routes for decades. As we approached in his float plane, the lake stretched out below us like polished glass, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to go on forever. The cabin was exactly what I'd hoped for, rustic, isolated and right on the water's edge. Mike helped me unload my gear and said he'd be back in 3 days. Just before he left, he casually mentioned something that should have been a red flag. If you hear anything weird at night, just stay inside. We've had a few incidents recently. When I pressed him about it, he just shrugged and said some other fishermen had reported their supplies being raided. I figured he meant bears and didn't think much of it at the time. The first day was perfect. The fishing was incredible. I caught several large brook trout and even a decent-sized landlocked salmon. I cleaned them right there on the deck, stored some in the cooler alongside my steaks and beers, and cooked up one for dinner. As the sun set, I sat on the deck with a beer, feeling pretty pleased with myself. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves and the occasional loon call echoing across the lake. Everything changed around 11 p.m. I was reading by lamplight inside when I heard something on the deck. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving my fishing gear around. But then came the heavy footsteps. They weren't like anything I'd heard before, not a bear's padding or a moose's clomping. These were different, more deliberate, almost human, but too heavy, too spread out. The deck creaked under the weight, and I could hear my tackle box being moved. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I didn't dare look out the windows. The lamplight inside would have made them into perfect mirrors anyway. Instead, I sat absolutely still, trying to control my breathing, which suddenly seemed deafening in the quiet cabin. The footsteps circled the cabin, slowly, methodically. Whatever it was big enough that its movements made the whole structure shudder slightly. I heard my cooler being opened, the distinctive creak of the hinges and the scrape of styrofoam. Then came the sound of rummaging through my supplies on the deck. The worst part was the breathing. Deep, heavy breaths, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was breathing through its nose, taking long, deliberate sniffs of the air. Several times it came right up to the windows. I could hear it sniffing at the edges of the frames, like it was trying to catch my scent. I had my phone, but of course there was no signal. The satellite phone was in my backpack, on the deck. The only weapons I had were a fishing knife and the bear spray, but using either would have meant getting close to whatever was out there. So I sat there, paralyzed, for what felt like hours. At one point, it knocked over something that made a loud crash. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Then came the sound of eating, not the messy chomping of a bear, but something more controlled. It was handling the food with purpose, almost like a person would. The sounds continued until around 3 a.m. I know because I watched every minute tick by on my watch, praying for daylight. Finally, the footsteps moved away from the cabin, becoming fainter until they disappeared into the forest. Even then, I didn't move from my spot until the first light of dawn started to creep through the windows. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, the deck looked like a disaster zone. My tackle box was overturned, but nothing was broken, just carefully moved aside. The cooler was open, and all my steaks were gone, along with most of my beers. But here's the weird part. The cans weren't crushed or torn open like a bear would do. They were opened normally, almost like someone had used the tab to pop them open. I found my potato salad container tipped over, and in the mess were what looked like partial footprints. They were huge, much bigger than my size 11 boots, but they weren't clear enough to make out any details. The strangest thing was that nothing was destroyed. Everything had been carefully moved and examined, like someone was purposefully looking through my things. The fish I'd caught were untouched in their separate cooler, which surprised me. If it had been a bear, it would have gone for the fish first. Whatever visited me that night had specific tastes. It wanted my steaks and beer, but wasn't interested in fresh fish. I spent the next hour taking photos of everything with my digital camera and trying to make sense of what had happened. The footprints in the potato salad had already started to dry up and weren't very clear in the photos. I wished I'd had the courage to look outside during the night, but honestly, I'm probably lucky I didn't. When Mike flew in to pick me up later that morning, I was packed and waiting on the dock. Before I could say anything, he took one look at my face and said, "You had a visitor last night, didn't you?" When I described what happened, he didn't seem surprised. He told me other fishermen had reported similar experiences: heavy footsteps, careful ransacking of supplies, stolen food and drinks. One guy even claimed he saw something massive moving through the trees, walking on two legs, but nobody had ever gotten a clear look at it. The thing that still haunts me isn't just what happened, but how methodical it all was. This wasn't some random animal looking for food. Whatever visited me that night knew exactly what it was doing. It knew how to open a cooler, how to open beer cans, and most disturbingly, it knew I was inside the cabin. It could have easily broken in. The door wasn't that sturdy, but it chose not to. I never went back to Big Reed Lake after that, and I haven't been fishing in Maine since. Sometimes when I'm having a beer in my garden back home in Bristol, I think about those beers that disappeared that night. I imagine something out there in the Maine wilderness, some unknown creature, cracking open a cold one and enjoying my steaks, and it sends shivers down my spine. I've read about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Some details match up, but others don't fit any pattern I've found. I don't know what visited me that night, and maybe I don't want to know. All I know is that something intelligent enough to open beer cans, but wild enough to strike terror into my heart, spent several hours circling my cabin that night, and I'll never forget it. The strangest part? Sometimes I catch myself missing that place, wanting to go back, to maybe get a glimpse of whatever it was. But then I remember the sound of those heavy footsteps on the deck, that deep, methodical breathing at the windows, and I realize some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 14. I grew up in a small house just outside Maple Falls, right where the town starts blending into the wilderness. Our backyard literally ended where the forest began. As kids, we were always told not to venture too deep into the woods, but you know how it is when you're young. Those warnings just made it more exciting. It was the summer of 1980, and I was 12. That summer started like any other, with me spending most of my time in our backyard, building forts and playing with my collection of Star Wars figures. We didn't have video games or smartphones back then. The forest was our playground. That day in July started normally enough. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest summer days, not too hot, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. Mum was inside making lunch, and I was in the backyard setting up an elaborate battle scene with my action figures on this big fallen log that had become my favorite spot. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know they're never really quiet. There's always birds chirping, squirrels rustling around, wind in the trees. But suddenly, everything just stopped. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. Even the insects went quiet. That's when I heard it, a sound that still wakes me up in cold sweats sometimes. It started as this deep, rumbling sound, almost like thunder, but it was a clear day. Then it changed into this horrific scream. I know it sounds crazy, but imagine an elephant's trumpet mixed with a lion's roar, but about 10 times louder and with this almost human quality to it. It wasn't just loud, it was primal. The kind of sound that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your gut, telling you to run. I froze. My whole body just locked up. The sound seemed to come from about 100 yards into the forest, and it echoed through the trees. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. When it finally stopped, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I left my toys right there and ran inside. Mom was in the kitchen and must have seen how pale I was, because she immediately asked what was wrong. When I told her about the sound, she tried to play it off as maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but I could tell she was worried. She called my dad at work, and he came home early that day. They both went out to check the yard, but found nothing except some broken branches deeper in the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that sound again. But that was just the beginning. The second encounter happened 6 years later, when I was 18. I had mostly convinced myself that the first incident was just my imagination running wild. I mean, that's what everyone told me, right? By then, I was in my senior year of high school and had started cycling as a hobby. We still lived in the same house, and I often rode my bike along this old logging road that ran parallel to the forest, where I'd heard the scream years before. It was late afternoon in October, around 5 p.m., and I was on my usual route. The sun was starting to set, and I was pushing to finish my ride before dark. I was about 2 miles from home when I got this feeling. You know that sensation, when you just know something's watching you. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I started pedaling faster. That's when I heard it. Heavy footfalls, keeping pace with my bike in the forest to my right. Whatever it was big enough to make the ground shake slightly with each step, and it was running parallel to me, just inside the tree line. I was doing about 15 mph on my bike, and this thing was keeping up without any problem. I didn't dare look directly into the woods. I just kept my eyes on the road and pedaled harder. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear branches snapping. The thing must have been just a few yards away from the road now. I could smell this horrible, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. Then I heard that same scream from my childhood, but this time it was right next to me. I nearly fell off my bike. I looked. I couldn't help it. And through the trees, I saw something massive moving alongside me. It was dark brown or black, and it was huge. The shape was all wrong for a bear. It was running upright, on 2 legs. I've never pedaled so hard in my life. My legs were burning, but pure adrenaline kept me going. Whatever it was followed me for about half a mile before I heard it veer off deeper into the forest. When I got home, I was hyperventilating so bad my mom thought I was having an asthma attack. My bike shorts were soaked with sweat, and my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I didn't ride that road again for months. When I finally told my friends, they either thought I was making it up or suggested it was a bear. But I know what bears look like when they run. This wasn't a bear. The third and final encounter was the one that really messed me up, because it was impossible to explain away. It happened 2 years later, in 1988. I was home from college for summer break and had started hiking again, trying to overcome my fear of the woods. One evening, I decided to take a short walk just before sunset. Stupid, I know, but I was trying to prove something to myself. I stuck to the edge of our property, never going more than a few 100 feet into the trees. I had my dad's old Polaroid camera with me because I'd been taking pictures of deer tracks for a biology project. The light was getting low, but it wasn't dark yet. I heard movement ahead of me, something big moving through the trees. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay still and quiet. About 50 yards ahead, through a gap in the trees, I saw it. The thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and dark, matted fur. It was standing behind a young cedar tree, trying to hide, but it was way too big to conceal itself completely. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the camera, but I managed to raise it and press the shutter. The flash went off, and that's when everything went crazy. The creature made this awful huffing sound and grabbed the cedar tree it was hiding behind. I'm not talking about shaking a branch here. This thing grabbed the entire tree, which must have been about 6 inches in diameter, and pushed it sideways until it snapped with a sound like a gunshot. I dropped the camera and ran. Behind me, I could hear trees crashing and that horrible scream again. I made it back to the house in record time and slammed the door behind me. My parents found me in the kitchen, white as a sheet and unable to speak properly for several minutes. The next morning, my dad and I went back to look for the camera and found it right where I'd dropped it. The Polaroid had developed overnight. The picture was blurry and dark, but you can clearly see something large and dark behind that cedar tree. More importantly, when we went a little further, we found the tree, snapped clean off about 4 feet up, with deep indentations in the bark that looked like finger marks. Dad took the picture with him to work that day and never brought it back. When I asked about it, he just said he'd lost it. But I saw his face when he was examining those marks in the tree. He knew this wasn't something normal. I moved away for college shortly after that, and never moved back to Maple Falls. My parents sold the house in the mid-90s, and I've only been back to the area a handful of times. But I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest, and I know I'm not alone in what I experienced. I still have nightmares about that scream sometimes. The weird thing is, as terrifying as these encounters were, I never felt like the creature was actually trying to hurt me. It seemed more curious than aggressive, especially during that last encounter. Like it was trying to hide, but was just too big to do it effectively. I've never been able to explain what I encountered in those woods. The rational part of my brain tries to dismiss it. But then I remember the sound of that tree snapping, the impossible speed of whatever ran alongside my bike, and that bone-chilling scream that started it all. Some things just defy explanation, and maybe that's okay. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I heard. Those sounds weren't from any known animal. Of that, I'm absolutely certain. I still get emails from my old neighbors about strange sounds in those woods, about pets going missing, and about trees being found snapped or pushed over. Whatever's out there, it's still there. I just hope anyone who encounters it is lucky enough to walk away with just a story to tell, like I did. Story 15. This happened back in 2002 when I was 24. My best friend Derek and I were really into mountain biking at the time. We'd spend almost every weekend exploring different trails across Ohio. That weekend in late October, we decided to do something different, an overnight camping trip combined with biking at Hanging Rock. The weather forecast was perfect, and we figured it would be an awesome adventure before it got too cold for camping. We arrived at the trail parking lot around 2 p.m. on Saturday. The plan was simple: bike until sunset, set up camp near one of the small lakes in the area, and head back the next morning. We'd checked the regulations beforehand. Camping was allowed as long as you stayed a certain distance from marked trails. The afternoon of biking was incredible. The fall colors were at their peak, and the trails were challenging enough to keep us engaged, but not so difficult that we couldn't enjoy the scenery. We covered about 15 miles before deciding to look for a camping spot around 6 p.m. as the sun was starting to set. We found what seemed like the perfect spot about half a mile off the main trail near one of the smaller lakes. It was a small clearing surrounded by oak and maple trees, with the lake visible through the trees about 50 feet away. The area was relatively flat, and there was enough dead wood around for a small campfire. It felt secluded, but not too remote. Exactly what we were looking for. We set up our 2-person tent, got a fire going, and spent the evening eating the sandwiches we'd packed and talking about future biking trips we wanted to take. Everything was completely normal until about 2 a.m. I remember the time precisely because I'd just checked my watch after waking up to pee. I was just getting back into the tent when I heard it, a loud splashing sound from the lake. At first, I thought it was probably a deer or maybe some raccoons. But then there was another splash, much bigger this time, like something massive had moved through the water. Derek woke up and whispered, "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, we heard heavy footsteps in the water, like something was wading through the shallows. The splashing continued for maybe 5 minutes, getting progressively louder. Whatever it was big, and it was moving around purposefully, not like an animal just stopping for a drink. Then everything went quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, wind in the trees, all of it just stopped. That's when we started to smell it, this overwhelming putrid odor like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The footsteps started again, but this time they weren't in the water. They were on land, and they were getting closer to our tent. The ground literally trembled with each step. I've been around bears before while camping in other states, and this was nothing like that. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. Whatever it was began circling our tent, slowly, methodically. Each circuit took about 2 minutes, and it made this sound. I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was like a deep, rumbling growl, but mixed with something that almost sounded like human speech, but distorted and wrong. Not words exactly, but something that felt like it was trying to be words. Derek and I were frozen in our sleeping bags. We had a hunting knife and bear spray, but somehow we both knew that wouldn't do any good against whatever was out there. The creature circled our tent 7 times. I counted each circuit, trying desperately to keep my mind focused on something other than pure panic. On the 7th circuit, it stopped right in front of our tent door. We could hear it breathing, deep, wet breaths that seemed to rattle the tent fabric. The smell was unbearable at this point. I was fighting the urge to vomit. Then it made this sound, like a cross between a roar and a scream, that was so loud it felt like my eardrums were going to burst. The tent shook violently, not like it was being touched, but like something massive had slammed into the ground next to it. We could hear trees creaking and branches snapping as whatever it was moved away from our campsite, back toward the lake. There was one final massive splash, and then nothing. We sat there in absolute silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. Neither of us dared to move or even whisper. Around 4 a.m., the normal nighttime sounds slowly started to return. Crickets first, then a distant owl. When the first light of dawn started to show through the tent fabric, we practically threw our camping gear into our backpacks. We didn't even bother to properly pack anything, just stuffed it all in and got the hell out of there. The bike ride back to the car was a blur of adrenaline and fear. We didn't stop once, didn't even slow down to drink water. It wasn't until we were back at the parking lot that we really looked at our surroundings. There were massive footprints in the mud near where we'd camped, at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The ground around our tent was torn up, with deep gouges in the earth that looked like they were made by massive claws or fingers. We found broken branches on trees around our campsite, not at deer height, but 8 to 10 feet up. Some of the breaks looked fresh, with sap still oozing out, and the grass and undergrowth around the tent was completely flattened in a circular pattern, showing exactly where that thing had walked around us. I've never gone camping again after that night. Derek and I hardly ever talk about what happened, but when we do, our stories match up perfectly. We've looked into other reports from the Hanging Rock area, and while there have been a few vague stories about strange noises and unexplained phenomena, nothing quite matches what we experienced. I know how this sounds. Trust me, if someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I would have thought they were making it up or exaggerating, but every single detail is burned into my memory. I still have nightmares about that growling sound and that horrible smell. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear those heavy footsteps outside my house. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Could it have been a bear? No, bears don't walk like that, don't make those sounds, and certainly don't circle a campsite 7 times. A person playing a prank? Impossible. No human could have made those footprints or reached those branches. Whatever was out there that night was something else entirely. I still mountain bike, but only on day trips, and never anywhere near Hanging Rock. Derek moved to Colorado a few years ago, but he texts me every October around the anniversary of that night. We don't even have to say anything specific, just checking in, making sure we both remember that what we experienced was real. I've never written about this before, and I probably never will again. But I needed to share it somewhere with people who might understand. If you're planning to camp in the Hanging Rock area, especially near any of the lakes, please be careful. And if you hear splashing in the water late at night, don't stick around to find out what's making it. Story 16. I was 28 at the time, living the nomad life in my '87 Volkswagen Westphalia camper van. I'd saved up enough money from my job as an IT consultant to take a year off and travel across the country. That particular week, I was exploring the remote areas of western New York State. It was beautiful country, all rolling hills and dense forests, the kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Around 6 p.m. on August 12th, I pulled off onto an unmarked dirt road near Cherry Creek. I'd been driving all day and wanted to find a quiet spot to camp for the night. About 2 miles down the road, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect, level ground, surrounded by tall pines, with enough open space to park comfortably. The nearest house had to be at least 5 miles away. The evening was gorgeous, one of those perfect late summer nights where the temperature is just right. I decided to treat myself to a nice dinner, since I'd been living off sandwiches and canned soup for the past few days. I had 2 thick ribeye steaks in my small propane-powered fridge that I'd picked up from a local butcher in the last town I'd passed through. I set up my portable grill outside the van and cracked open a beer while the steaks sizzled. The smell was incredible. There's nothing quite like grilling a good steak in the outdoors. In hindsight, that smell probably carried for miles in the still evening air. If I'd known what it would attract, I would have stuck to my usual PB&J. After dinner, I cleaned up and settled in for the night. I had my usual routine, reading for a bit by lantern light before turning in around 10 p.m. The van was comfortable enough, with a fold-out bed in the back and all my basic necessities within arm's reach. I remember checking my watch just before switching off the light. It was 10:22 p.m. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, because the next thing I remember was being jolted awake by what felt like an earthquake. The entire van was shaking violently. At first, in my groggy state, I thought maybe a bear had found my trash bag, even though I'd hung it in a tree about 50 yards away. But this was different. The van wasn't just being bumped or rocked. It was being deliberately shaken with incredible force. The sound is what really got to me. There were these deep, guttural vocalizations, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, something in between, but distinctly primate-like. And there wasn't just one voice. There were at least 3 distinct sounds coming from different directions around the van. I scrambled to the front seat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the chaos outside. That's when I saw them through the windshield, illuminated by the nearly full moon. I wish I could say my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I know what I saw. There were 3 of them, They were massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Their bodies were covered in thick, reddish-brown hair that looked almost rust-colored in the moonlight. But it was their faces that haunted me. They looked almost human-like, but with heavy brow ridges and wide, flat noses. Their eyes caught the moonlight and seemed to glow with an amber color. One of them was at the front of the van, another on the driver's side, and the third by the rear. They were coordinated, working together to terrorize me. The one at the front kept slamming its massive hands down on the hood, leaving deep dents in the metal. The one by the driver's side was actually trying to rock the van over, and coming disturbingly close to succeeding. The third one was pulling at the rear door hard enough that I could hear the hinges creaking. The strength they displayed was beyond anything I could comprehend. These creatures were moving my 3,000-pound van like it was a toy. Every impact made the whole vehicle shudder, and I could hear metal groaning and glass creaking. I was certain the windows would shatter at any moment. I was paralyzed with fear, crouched in the front seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. The noise they were making was deafening. Those horrible vocalizations mixed with the sound of their massive hands pounding on metal. They seemed angry, agitated. Maybe the smell of the steaks had drawn them in, and they were frustrated at not finding any food. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The one at the front suddenly stopped pounding and pressed its face right up against the windshield. Its breath fogged up the glass, and I found myself staring directly into its eyes. They were intelligent eyes. There was something unnervingly aware in that gaze. It wasn't the mindless stare of a predator. There was consciousness there, calculation. The creature held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it did something that chilled me to my core. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a deliberate baring of teeth that communicated something between threat and amusement. Its teeth were yellowed and huge, clearly visible in the moonlight. Just when I thought the van's frame couldn't take any more abuse, something strange happened. The creature at the front suddenly straightened up and made a different kind of vocalization, something that sounded almost like a bark or a command. The other two immediately stopped what they were doing. They all stood still for a moment, their heads cocked as if listening for something. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they melted away into the darkness of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there shaking for what must have been hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. I kept expecting them to come back, to finish whatever they had started. When the first light of dawn finally started to creep through the trees, I jumped into the driver's seat and got the hell out of there. The van was severely damaged, deep dents all over, the rear door barely hanging on its hinges, the hood crumpled like aluminum foil. I drove straight to the nearest town, probably breaking every speed limit along the way. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've read every book I could find about Bigfoot encounters, joined online forums, even reached out to researchers. While there have been other reports of aggressive Bigfoot behavior, few match the coordinated, almost tactical nature of what I experienced. The fact that there were 3 of them working together, their obvious intelligence, and that final moment when they seemed to respond to some signal I couldn't hear, it all suggests something far more complex than just wild animals. The physical evidence was undeniable. The damage to my van cost over $3,000 to repair, and the mechanic couldn't explain how the metal had been warped in such a way. I still have photographs of the damage, though I rarely show them to anyone. Some things are better left unexplained. I never went back to Cherry Creek, and I sold the van a few months later. I couldn't stand looking at those repaired dents without remembering that night. These days, I stick to established campgrounds when I travel, and I never ever cook meat outside after sunset. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear those vocalizations, still see those intelligent eyes staring at me through the windshield. I know what I saw that night, even if I can't fully explain it. Whatever those creatures were, they weren't just figments of my imagination or misidentified bears. They were something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist but does. I'm sharing this now because I think people need to know what's out there. The forests of America hide things we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. But I know what I experienced that night in Cherry Creek, and I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. Story 17. I'm retired now, but I still keep in touch with my old partner, Mike. We try to get together at least once a month, usually for some hiking or fishing, anything to get out of the city and into nature. That particular Saturday in late October, Mike brought his 14-year-old son, Tyler, along. The kid had been going through a rough patch after his mom's passing, and these outdoor trips seemed to help. We decided to explore a remote area in Kern County, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I'd heard from some locals about good hiking trails there, and since none of us had been before, it seemed like a perfect opportunity for some adventure. The weather was unusually cool for California, probably in the low 50s, with a light fog hanging between the trees. We arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m. The parking area was empty except for our truck, which wasn't unusual for such a remote spot. I remember checking my phone. No service, of course. Mike joked about how peaceful it was to be disconnected from the world for a while. If only we'd known what was coming. The first couple of hours were exactly what you'd expect from a fall hike in California. The trail wasn't particularly well maintained, but it was beautiful. Old-growth forest, lots of pine needles crunching under our boots, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Tyler was actually smiling, taking pictures of interesting mushrooms with his phone. It felt good to see the kid enjoying himself. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a small creek. That's when things started feeling different. The forest had gone quiet. You know that silence that comes before a storm? It was like that, but worse. Even the creek seemed to be running quieter. Mike noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept looking around while we ate our sandwiches. Then we heard it. The first scream. I've heard mountain lions. I've heard bears. This wasn't either of those. The sound started low, almost like a human moan, but it quickly built into something that I can only describe as primal. It was so powerful that I could feel it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. But this wasn't music. This was raw and wild and angry. Tyler dropped his sandwich and grabbed his dad's arm. The scream lasted for what must have been 45 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. The worst part? We couldn't tell where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and bouncing around us. When it finally stopped, none of us moved. I could hear Tyler breathing fast, trying not to panic. Mike had his hand on his son's shoulder, but I could see his knuckles were white from gripping too hard. 27 years of police work kicks in at moments like this. I started mentally cataloguing our resources. 1 hunting knife, my old service revolver, I always carry when hiking, force of habit, 3 water bottles, 2 power banks, and our phones with no signal. We should head back, Mike said quietly. No argument from me or Tyler. We started packing up our lunch, trying to move quickly but quietly. That's when we heard the crack, like someone had snapped a baseball bat in half. It came from about 50 yards behind us, up the slope. Then another crack, closer this time. Something was moving through the forest, something big enough to break substantial branches as it walked. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't trying to be stealthy. I motioned for Mike and Tyler to start moving back toward the trail while I kept my eyes on the tree line where the sounds were coming from. The fog had gotten thicker, making it hard to see more than 30 or 40 yards ahead. We could still hear the heavy footsteps, matching our pace, staying just out of sight. Then the smell hit us. If you've ever driven past a landfill on a hot day, mix that with wet dog and something metallic, like old blood. Tyler gagged. I nearly did too. We picked up our pace, trying to stay quiet while moving as fast as we could without running. The thing in the woods kept pace with us. Every few minutes we'd hear another branch snap or a heavy footfall. It was paralleling our movement, staying just inside the tree line. Then it screamed again. This time it was closer, much closer. The sound was so powerful it made my teeth hurt. Tyler started crying, not even trying to hide it. I don't blame him. I've been in shootouts that scared me less than that sound. It was pure, animalistic rage. The scream triggered something in us, some primitive part of our brains that said, run. We ran. All pretense of staying calm was gone. We just ran as fast as we could down that trail. I'm not proud to admit this, but in that moment, I forgot every bit of my police training. We were just three humans running from something that every instinct told us wasn't supposed to exist. As we ran, I could hear it crashing through the forest beside us, no longer trying to stay hidden. The footfalls were heavy enough to vibrate the ground. That's not an exaggeration or my mind playing tricks. I could literally feel the impacts through my boots. We ran until Tyler stumbled and fell. Mike and I immediately stopped to help him up, and in that moment of stillness, we heard nothing. The crashing pursuit had stopped. The forest was dead quiet again. We stood there, catching our breath, straining to hear anything. Tyler was quietly sobbing, his face buried in his dad's jacket. Minutes passed. Nothing. That's when I noticed the trees around us. Several branches as thick as my arm had been broken, not cut, not torn, but snapped clean off. These breaks were fresh, the wood still light-colored and wet with sap. Some of these branches were 15 feet off the ground. But what really got to me were the markings on one of the trees. 5 long, deep gouges in the bark, each one about an inch wide, running parallel to each other. They started about 8 feet up the trunk and ran down almost to the ground. The marks were fresh. There were still bits of bark hanging from them. We didn't stay to investigate further. We walked the remaining mile to our truck as fast as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. The feeling of being watched never left us. When we finally reached the parking area, we practically dove into the truck. Mike's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As we pulled away, I looked in the side mirror and saw something that still shows up in my nightmares. Movement in the tree line. Just a shadow in the fog, but it was big, far too big to be a person. The drive home was silent. What could we say? We all knew what we'd experienced, but none of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. A few days later, I started researching. I found recordings online of supposed Bigfoot calls. When I played one, Tyler left the room. Mike just shook his head and said, "That's it. That's exactly what we heard." I've gone back and forth about sharing this story. As a former law enforcement officer, I know how it sounds. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened, trying to explain it away as a bear or multiple animals or anything that would fit into my understanding of the world. But I know what we experienced that day wasn't normal. The strangest part. A week after our experience, I drove back out there alone. Probably not my smartest decision. I wanted to document those claw marks, take pictures of the broken branches. But when I got there, I couldn't find any of it. The tree with the gouges, the broken branches, all gone. If it weren't for the lingering nightmares and the way Tyler still refuses to go hiking, I might have convinced myself it was all in our heads. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what we experienced that day was real. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's not something that's supposed to exist. And maybe that's for the best. These days, When I hear people talk about Bigfoot sightings or laugh about creatures in the woods, I just stay quiet. Because I know the truth. Sometimes the legends we dismiss as campfire stories have more truth to them than we're ready to accept. And sometimes the most terrifying part isn't seeing the monster, it's knowing it's there, but never getting a clear look at what's hunting you. Story 18. It was early October, unseasonably warm for autumn. I'd convinced my riding buddies Mike and Steve to explore some unofficial trails I'd heard about from locals. The area wasn't exactly legal to ride in, but we figured the worst that could happen would be getting asked to leave by security. We started early, around 7 a.m., when the morning fog was still clinging to the ground. The humidity made everything feel heavy and damp. The trails were rough but rideable, weaving through dense forest and alongside the power plant's fence line. The constant humming from the transformers created this weird background noise that seemed to make the woods feel even more isolated. About 2 hours into our ride, we decided to take a break. That's when Steve noticed something odd about the trees ahead of us. At first, we thought it was just storm damage, but as we got closer, we realized something wasn't right. The branches were bent and woven together in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. They formed this massive dome-like structure, probably 15 feet high and twice as wide. My heart started racing when I saw what looked like fresh breaks in some of the larger branches. Whatever did this had serious strength. These weren't twigs, but thick branches that would take serious force to snap. The whole structure reminded me of a giant bird's nest, but the scale was all wrong, way too big for any animal I knew of. The creepiest part was the rope. There were these thick pieces of rope tied between several trees, about 8 feet off the ground. Not camping rope or anything you'd buy at a store. This stuff looked handmade, like someone or something had twisted together plant fibers. Some sections were frayed and weathered, but others looked relatively new. Mike wanted to leave immediately, but I couldn't help myself. I took out my phone to take pictures, which I later lost when my phone died completely that same day. Still kicks myself about that. As I was moving around the structure, I noticed this overwhelming smell. It's hard to describe, kind of musty and wild, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much stronger. The kind of smell that triggers something primitive in your brain, telling you you're not supposed to be there. That's when we heard it. A deep, throaty sound that wasn't quite a growl, but definitely wasn't human. It came from somewhere behind us, maybe 100 yards away. The sound echoed off the power plant's concrete walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. Steve, who's usually the calmest guy I know, turned white as a sheet. We all froze, barely breathing. Then we heard branches breaking, big ones, and heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big and it was moving fast. The footsteps had this weird rhythm, like a person walking but with a much longer stride. That's when I saw it, through a gap in the trees. I only got a glimpse, but it's burned into my memory. It was tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen, probably 8 or 9 feet. What struck me most was its hair, this silvery grey colour that seemed to shimmer in the patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. It moved with this fluid grace that seemed impossible for something that size. We didn't stick around to see more. We grabbed our bikes and rode harder than we ever had before. I remember the blind panic, branches whipping at my face as we tore down the trail. The whole time, we could hear movement paralleling our path through the woods, keeping pace with us, even though we were on bikes. The really terrifying part? Whatever it was, it seemed to be herding us. Every time we tried to turn back toward the main road, we'd hear that sound again, closer this time, forcing us to turn another way. It kept pushing us deeper into the woods, away from civilization. My legs were burning, and the fear of crashing at that speed was real, but the fear of stopping was even worse. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, we finally broke through to a clearing near some power lines. The sounds stopped abruptly. We didn't slow down until we reached the main road, and we didn't say a word to each other until we got back to our cars. Later that day, I tried to convince myself it was just some homeless person's camp we'd stumbled upon. But that doesn't explain the impossible size of that structure, or the strength it would take to break those branches, or that silvery hair, or the way it moved. The local sheriff's office wasn't interested in our story, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it myself. I've been back to those woods exactly once since then, about a month later, with a larger group. We found the area where the structure had been, but everything was gone. No broken branches, no woven dome, no ropes. The only evidence anything had ever been there was some flattened ground and a few unusually broken trees about 30 feet up. The power plant workers we talked to that day just shrugged it off, but one older guy pulled me aside. He told me they occasionally find similar structures deep in the woods, always abandoned, always gone within a few days. He mentioned that during night shifts, they sometimes hear strange sounds echoing across the facility, and that motion sensors go off in patterns that don't make sense for any known animal. I still mountain bike, but never alone anymore, and never near that power plant. Sometimes when I'm riding through dense forest, I catch a whiff of that same musty smell, and my heart starts racing. I've tried to rationalize what we saw that day, but I can't. All I know is that something intelligent lives in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found, but isn't afraid to let you know you're in its territory. The thing that really keeps me up at night, those ropes. Whatever made them had to have hands, had to understand how to weave and tie knots. That's not animal behavior, but it's not quite human either. I don't know what we encountered that day, but I do know that my understanding of what's possible, of what exists in our world, changed forever in those woods. Story 19. This happened in April 2019 when I took my family camping near Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. My wife Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. We wanted to teach our kids Emma, 12, and Jack, 9, how to fish, and I'd heard great things about Little Buck Creek from my colleague Mike, who goes there every spring. We arrived early Friday morning, and everything started normally enough. The weather was perfect, mid-60s, slightly overcast, with that fresh spring smell in the air. We found a nice spot about half a mile from where we parked the car, far enough from the main camping areas to feel secluded, but not so remote that we couldn't get back to civilization if needed. The creek was running clear and looked perfect for fishing. While setting up camp, I noticed something odd about some of the younger trees along the creek bank. Several of them, maybe 6 or 7 that I could see, were snapped about halfway up, not cut or broken by wind, but literally snapped like you'd break a pencil. I remember thinking it was strange because they were pretty thick saplings, not something a person could easily break. I pointed it out to Sarah, but we figured maybe some bears had been roughhousing or something. We get black bears in Tennessee all the time, so it didn't seem worth worrying about. We spent the morning teaching the kids how to bait hooks and cast. Emma took to it naturally, but Jack was more interested in collecting rocks and splashing in the shallow parts of the creek. Around noon, Sarah started unpacking lunch, while I walked along the bank looking for good fishing spots for the afternoon. That's when I saw the footprints. I've been hunting and fishing my whole life. I've seen every kind of animal track you can find in Tennessee. These weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and deep in the mud, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The stride length between prints was massive, maybe 4 to 5 feet apart. They looked almost human-like, but no human has feet that big. I called Sarah over to look at them, trying not to alarm the kids. She went pale when she saw them. We decided not to say anything to Emma and Jack. They were having such a good time, and we didn't want to scare them. But we did agree to move our campsite about 50 yards closer to the main trail, making it seem like we just found a better spot. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful. We caught a few small bass, and the kids were thrilled. As it got darker, we made dinner over the campfire and roasted marshmallows. Everything felt normal again, and I started to think maybe I'd overreacted about the footprints. Then night fell. We were all in our tents by 10 p.m. Sarah and I had our own tent, and the kids were right next to us in theirs. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, but something woke me up around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around our campsite. The footsteps would stop occasionally, and during those pauses, I could hear deep, heavy breathing. Not like an animal panting, but more like someone breathing through their nose, just bigger, much bigger. Sarah was awake too. I could feel her trembling next to me. We lay there perfectly still, barely breathing ourselves. The kids' tent was only a few feet away, and I was terrified they would wake up and make noise. Then the smell hit us. If you've ever been near a wet dog, imagine that smell, but mixed with something much more pungent and wild. It was so strong, it made my eyes water. Whatever was out there was close enough that we could hear it sniffing the air. The thing moved around our campsite for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20-30 minutes. We heard it rustling through our supplies, but I wasn't about to look outside. Finally, the footsteps started moving away, and the breathing faded into the distance. Neither of us slept after that. We lay there until the first light of dawn, then waited another hour just to be safe. When we finally got up the courage to unzip our tent, what we found made my blood run cold. Our fishing gear box, which had been right outside our tent, was now about 100 feet away, thrown against a tree. But that's not what scared me the most. On the muddy side of the box were these enormous finger marks, not claw marks like a bear would leave, but actual fingers, like a human hand, but massive. The mud had preserved the prints perfectly, including what looked like fingerprints. The smell still lingered in the air, especially strong around where the box had been thrown. We found more footprints too, exactly like the ones I'd seen by the creek, but these were fresh. They circled our tents multiple times before leading off into the woods. We packed up camp in record time. The kids were confused and complained about leaving early, but one look at those footprints was all Sarah and I needed. We made up some excuse about bad weather coming and got out of there as fast as we could. Here's the thing that still haunts me. As we were leaving, I noticed more of those broken trees, fresh ones that definitely hadn't been broken the day before. Whatever had visited us that night had enough strength to snap 4-inch thick saplings like they were twigs. I've never told this story publicly before. We didn't report it because, honestly, who would believe us? I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the area, and while I've found a few stories that sound similar, nothing quite matches what we experienced. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a bear walking weird. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe the isolation and darkness played tricks on our minds. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I smelled. Those finger marks on our fishing box weren't from any animal I know of. We haven't been camping since then. The kids still ask sometimes, but Sarah and I always find excuses not to go. I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched, studied even. Like whatever it was could have hurt us at any time, but chose not to. I still fish, but only at developed campgrounds now, never in the backcountry. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep at night, I can still hear that deep, heavy breathing and smell that wild, musky odor. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but I know one thing for certain. We weren't alone, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy, if my mind has somehow twisted the memory over the years. But then I look at the photos I took of those footprints and the finger marks on our box, which I still have stored in my garage, those marks still visible. And I know it was real. Whatever it was real, and it's still out there. Story 20. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened to my wife Sarah and me last year in Deer Lodge, Montana, still keeps me up at night. We'd bought this remote cabin as our dream getaway spot. You know, somewhere to escape from the city noise and just reconnect with nature. It's about 15 miles outside of town, surrounded by dense forest. The previous owners had maintained it well, and the isolation was exactly what we were looking for. At least, that's what we thought. Everything was perfectly normal for the first few months. We'd spend long weekends there, enjoying the peace and quiet, watching deer wander through our property, and working on small improvement projects. The trouble started last October. At first, it was just little things that seemed odd, but not necessarily alarming. Some of our apple trees had been stripped of fruit overnight, which we initially blamed on deer or bears. But something felt off about it. There were no partially eaten apples on the ground, no sign of animals climbing or breaking branches. Everything was just gone. Then came the knocking. I'll never forget the first night we heard it. Sarah and I were getting ready for bed around 11 p.m. when there was this distinct pattern of knocks on the east wall of our bedroom. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 slower ones. It was loud enough to make us both freeze. I grabbed my flashlight and checked outside, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement in the trees, nothing. We tried to brush it off as a branch hitting the house, but deep down, we knew that wasn't it. The knocks had been too deliberate, too purposeful. The next night, it happened again, but this time from the living room wall. Same pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow. I installed motion sensor lights around the house the following weekend, thinking that would deter whatever was causing it. It didn't. Instead, it gave us our first glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. It was around 2 a.m. when the security lights suddenly flooded the backyard. Sarah shook me awake, and we both went to the window. That's when we saw it. A massive dark figure standing at the tree line, partially obscured by a large pine. Even hunched over, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and despite the bright lights, its features seemed to absorb the light somehow, making it hard to make out details. But what I could see clearly were its eyes. They reflected the light like a deer's, but much higher off the ground. We stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it moved. Not toward us, thank God, but sideways, disappearing behind the trees with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something that size. The motion sensor lights clicked off, plunging everything back into darkness. The next morning, I found what I can only describe as deliberate arrangements of broken branches around our property. They were laid out in geometric patterns, perfect triangles and squares made of sticks that were definitely not there the day before. Some of the branches were thick, the kind that would take significant strength to break. What disturbed me most was that these patterns seemed to point toward our house, like arrows marking a path. I set up trail cameras that day, 4 of them, covering all approaches to the house. That night, the knocking started again, but different. It moved around the house in a clockwise pattern, getting progressively louder. The sound was accompanied by this deep, resonating grunt that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was almost like someone trying to mimic a bear, but wrong somehow, more guttural. When we checked the cameras the next morning, 3 of them had been turned around to face the trees. The 4th one, though, that's what made us seriously consider selling the cabin. It had captured a clear image of something standing right outside our bedroom window at 3:17 a.m. The figure was enormous, its head actually higher than the camera mounted under the eaves of our single-story cabin. Its arm was raised, knuckles pressed against the glass, caught in the act of knocking. The image quality wasn't great. Trail cams aren't known for their nighttime clarity, but what detail we could make out was enough to turn my blood cold. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were too long, hanging down past where knees should be. The head sat directly on massive shoulders, no real neck to speak of. But it was the face that haunts me. Even in the grainy image, you could make out features that seemed almost human-like, but distorted, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face without ever having seen one properly. The eyes were too far apart, deeply set under a heavy brow ridge, and that mouth, it was too wide, stretching across what should have been cheeks. We didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, we sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. The knocking started again around midnight, but this time it was different. Instead of the usual pattern, it was constant, moving from wall to wall, faster than anything should have been able to move around the house. The grunting was louder too, and sometimes it would shift into something almost like speech, not words exactly, but sounds that seemed to have purpose, intention. Around 4 a.m., everything suddenly went quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, oppressive. Then we heard footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate steps that made the whole house creak. They crossed directly above us, stopped over the living room, and then a thud so powerful it knocked pictures off our walls. Sarah screamed, and I'm not ashamed to admit I did too. That was when the power went out. Complete darkness, except for our flashlights. The footsteps moved back across the roof, and then we heard something slide down the wall outside. In the beam of my flashlight through the window, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and movement, and then the sound of something very large moving through the trees. We left at first light. As we were pulling out of the driveway, I saw one last thing that made me floor the accelerator. A new arrangement of branches in the front yard, laid out in a perfect circle with our trail camera placed in the center, lens shattered. We've only been back once during daylight to collect some essential belongings. The cabin's been on the market for months now, but something tells me it's going to be hard to sell. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still there, still making its patterns with branches, still waiting to play its mysterious knocking game with the next owners. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to explain it away as an elaborate prank or a bear with unusual behavior patterns. But I know what I saw. That trail cam photo is burned into my memory, and sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night in our city apartment, I still hear phantom knocks on the wall. 3 quick, 2 slow. The worst part? About a week after we left, I was researching similar incidents in the area and found out that the previous owners had moved out suddenly too, just 6 months into their ownership. They never gave a reason. Now I think I know why, and I wonder how many others before them heard those knocks in the night and saw those intelligent, terrifying eyes staring back at them through their windows. To this day, I can't explain what it wanted or why it seemed so focused on our house. Was it trying to communicate something? Was it just curious, or did it have more sinister intentions? I don't know, and honestly, I don't want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some mysteries should remain in the dark forests where they belong. Story 21. It was mid-October 2020, during that brief window when COVID restrictions had eased up a bit in Washington state. My friends Mike, Sarah, and I decided to take advantage of the unusually clear weather to go hiking near Concrete. We're all experienced hikers and have done plenty of trails in the North Cascades, but none of us were prepared for what we encountered that day. We picked a lesser-known trail that branches off from Baker Lake Road. The trailhead was empty when we arrived around 9 a.m., not unusual for a Wednesday morning. The air was crisp, and there was this light morning mist hanging between the trees. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first. We were just happy to be outside after being cooped up for so long. About 2 miles in, Mike noticed something odd about the trees. At first we thought it was storm damage, but as we kept walking, we saw more and more trees that were wrong. These weren't fallen or broken trees. They were bent. Not just bent, but curved into perfect arches, like giant doorways in the forest. Some of these trees were thick, the kind that would take several people to wrap their arms around. The weird part was how uniform they all were, forming this sort of pathway deeper into the woods. Sarah, who works as a forest ranger in Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, said she'd never seen anything like it. The trees weren't damaged or splintered, they were growing that way, which made no sense. Some looked like they'd been bent years ago, while others seemed more recent. We started taking pictures because, honestly, who would believe this without proof? That's when things got weird. While we were photographing the trees, I heard something moving in the dense undergrowth about 50 yards to our right. At first I thought it was a deer. We get lots of those around here. But the movement was too deliberate, too steady. Whatever it was keeping pace with us, moving parallel to the trail. The sounds weren't random either. Whatever was moving through the brush would stop when we stopped, and move when we moved. Mike heard it too. I could tell by the way he kept looking over his shoulder. Sarah suggested we make some noise to scare off any wildlife, so we called out and clapped our hands. That's when we heard it. 3 distinct knocks on wood, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. The sounds came from the direction of the movement, but then we heard answering knocks from the other side of the trail. The air changed. I know how that sounds, but I don't know how else to describe it. This overwhelming smell hit us, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah actually gagged. We decided to turn back. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. The whole atmosphere had shifted from peaceful to threatening in a matter of minutes. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that heavy silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. As we turned to leave, we heard movement again, but closer this time, much closer. There was a crash in the undergrowth, like something big moving through the trees. The knocking sounds started again, faster now, coming from multiple directions. We started walking quickly back toward the trailhead, trying not to run, but definitely moving faster than a normal hiking pace. That's when we heard this sound. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a scream. It was deep and guttural, but had this almost human quality to it that made my skin crawl. It echoed through the trees, and I swear you could feel it in your chest. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard she left bruises. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We absolutely bolted down that trail, branches whipping at our faces, scrambling over rocks and roots. The whole time, we could hear something crashing through the forest parallel to us, keeping pace effortlessly. Every few seconds, those knocking sounds would echo through the trees, sometimes from one side, sometimes from the other. About halfway back to the trailhead, Mike tripped. Sarah and I helped him up, and that's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 30 yards away, something was standing there. It was huge. I'm talking at least 8 feet tall. The details are blurry in my memory, but I remember its silhouette was massive, much wider than a person. It was dark-colored, and even from that distance, I could see its chest moving as it breathed. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it moved, not toward us, but parallel again, disappearing behind the trees with an agility that something that size shouldn't have. We didn't stick around to see more. We made it back to the car in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. None of us spoke during the drive back to town. What could we even say? Later that night we looked through the photos we'd taken of the bent trees. Most of them were blurry from us rushing, but one of them, I almost deleted all the photos when I saw it. In the background, partially hidden behind a tree trunk, there's a dark figure. It's mostly in shadow, but you can clearly see its outline and its height compared to the surrounding trees. But what really gets me is its eyes. There are 2 points of reflection, like when you catch an animal's eyes in a flash photo, but they're way too high off the ground to be any normal wildlife. I've shown the photo to a few people who know the area. Most of them dismiss it as shadows or pareidolia, but a couple of old-timers got really quiet when they saw it. One of them, a guy who's lived in concrete his whole life, told me there's a reason nobody goes to that part of the forest anymore. We reported what we found to the local ranger station, but they just logged it as unusual tree growth and possible bear activity. Sarah eventually requested a transfer to a different district. Mike sold his hiking gear and hasn't been back on a trail since. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that area. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I catch that same smell on the wind, just for a second. When that happens, I turn around and head home, no matter how far I've come. The thing that really haunts me isn't just what we saw that day. It's the intelligence behind it. Those bent trees weren't random, the way it paralleled us, the coordinated knocking from different directions. Whatever was out there was thinking, planning, and most likely, hunting. I've spent hours researching similar encounters in the area, and there are more than you'd think. Most people don't talk about them openly. Who wants to be known as the crazy person who claims they saw Bigfoot? But late at night, in local bars or around campfires, you'll hear similar stories. The bent trees, the knocking sounds, the smell, the feeling of being watched. I don't know what's out there in the forests around concrete. I don't know if I want to know. But I do know this. There are things in those woods that defy explanation, and sometimes the old stories exist for a reason. I still have that photo somewhere, buried in a folder on my computer. I don't look at it anymore. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I'm tempted to dig it out, to prove to myself that it really happened. But then I remember those eyes, that impossible height, and that deep, rumbling sound that was almost, but not quite, human. And I leave the photo where it is. The worst part? Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I can still hear those knocks in the distance, echoing through the trees, and I wonder if whatever made them is still out there, bending trees and watching, always watching. Story 22. We bought this place back in 2019, just a small 2-bedroom cabin about 15 minutes outside of Cloudcroft. Nothing fancy, but it was our escape from the city. My wife Sarah and I would take our kids there maybe once a month, usually on weekends. The kids loved it because they could play in the snow during winter, and we loved the peace and quiet. Well, at least until that night. It started with the whistling. I know how that sounds, but bear with me. We'd been at the cabin for a couple of days during the kids' winter break. There had been a light snowfall the night before, just enough to dust everything white. The kids were disappointed it wasn't enough for snowmen, but they still had fun playing outside that afternoon. That evening, around 6 p.m., my daughter Emma, she was 9 at the time, said she heard someone whistling outside. I didn't think much of it at first. Sound carries weirdly in the mountains, and we'd occasionally hear noises from other properties. But then I heard it too. It wasn't like normal whistling. It was almost melodic, but wrong somehow. Like someone trying to imitate a tune, but not quite getting it right. The pitch was off, and it would sometimes hold notes for way too long. Sarah suggested it was probably just the wind, but I've heard wind whistling through trees before, and this wasn't it. This had pattern and intention to it. The kids were getting a bit spooked, so we closed all the curtains and decided to have an early dinner. I remember trying to keep things normal, making jokes about the mountain musicians while we ate our spaghetti, but I kept catching myself straining to hear more. After dinner, around 7:30 p.m., Emma needed to use the bathroom. Our cabin's setup is a bit weird. The main bathroom window faces the back of the property, where the tree line starts. Emma came running out just seconds after going in, crying and saying she saw red eyes looking at her through the window. Now our bathroom window is pretty high up, maybe 7 or 8 feet off the ground because of the way the cabin sits on a slope. I figured she probably saw the reflection of something, or maybe her own eyes in the dark window. To calm her down, I went to check. I switched off the bathroom light so I could see better outside, and that's when I saw them too. 2 red dots, like reflective eyes, but way too high up to be any normal animal. They weren't the bright red you'd get from a flashlight reflecting off an animal's eyes. These were darker, almost like dull coals glowing. As soon as I moved closer to the window, they disappeared. My hands were shaking as I turned the light back on. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared, but I tried to keep it together for the kids. I told Emma it was probably just a weird reflection and hustled everyone into the living room for a movie night. But I couldn't focus on the movie at all. The whistling had stopped, but now there was this feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. Around 9 p.m., we put the kids to bed in their room. Our cabin has this layout where both bedrooms are on the same side, with windows facing the east where the forest gets really dense. Sarah and I stayed up in the living room, trying to act normal, but both feeling on edge. That's when we started hearing the footsteps. At first, it sounded like something heavy walking in the snow around the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I tried telling myself it was just snow falling from tree branches, but the pattern was too regular. Sarah grabbed my arm and whispered that we should call someone, but who would we even call? The police would take at least 30 minutes to get there, and what would we tell them? That we heard whistling and footsteps. The steps would stop for a few minutes, then start again. They seemed to follow a pattern, from the back of the house, along the side with the bedrooms, to the front, then back again, like something was patrolling. I grabbed my flashlight and worked up the courage to look out the front window. The snow had picked up a bit, but there was enough moonlight to see the yard. That's when I noticed the tracks. These weren't animal tracks, at least not like any I'd ever seen. They were huge. I measured them the next morning, and they were 18 inches if they were a centimeter. But it wasn't just their size that was unsettling. They were clearly footprints with 5 distinct toes, and they were fresh. The snow was still falling, but these prints were deep enough that they weren't filling in. Whatever made them was heavy. I followed the tracks with my flashlight from the window. They made a perfect patrol route around our cabin, but the most disturbing part was how they deviated slightly at each bedroom window, like whatever it was had stopped to look inside. I felt sick to my stomach. Around 10:30 p.m., the kids woke up crying. They said they could hear breathing outside their window. Not just normal breathing. They described it as heavy and wet sounding, like someone with a bad cold breathing through their mouth. Sarah wanted to move them to the living room, but I was worried about crossing in front of the windows. We ended up making a blanket fort in the hallway, trying to turn it into an adventure rather than let them see how terrified we were. That's when the knocking started. Not on the door, on the bedroom windows. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on Emma's window, then 3 on our bedroom window, then back to Emma's. Each knock made a different sound than a normal knock would. It was duller, like something soft but massive hitting the glass. We could hear whatever it was moving between the windows, its feet crunching in the snow. I had my phone out, trying to record, but all you can hear on the video is our breathing and those horrible knocks. I did set up my phone to record through the bedroom window at one point, and that's when I caught something on video that still makes my skin crawl. Between knocks, you can see those red eyes again, but this time they're moving, and you can just barely make out a massive dark shape behind them. The video is grainy and dark, but there's one frame where you can see what looks like a huge hand with grey-black hair pressing against the window. This went on for hours. The whistling would start up again, then stop. The knocking would move from window to window. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like sniffing at the door. The kids eventually fell asleep in our blanket fort, but Sarah and I stayed up all night, huddled together with my hunting rifle across my lap. I'm not even sure what I would have done with it. The thing outside felt so massive that I doubt my rifle would have done much good. Around 4 a.m., everything just stopped. The forest got quiet. That deep, heavy quiet that feels like a weight on your chest. We waited another hour before I got up the courage to look outside. The snow had stopped, and in the pre-dawn light, I could see the tracks clearly. They led from our cabin straight into the forest, but here's the strangest part. While the tracks coming toward our cabin were spaced normally, like something walking, the tracks leading away were much further apart, like whatever it was had started running or leaping through the snow. We packed up and left as soon as the sun was fully up. I took photos of all the tracks and even made some plaster casts, though they didn't turn out great because of the snow. We haven't been back to the cabin at night since then. We still go during the day sometimes, but we always leave before sunset. I've heard there were other reports of strange whistling in the area around that time, and a few other people found similar tracks. Someone even got a trail cam photo of those same red eyes. But whatever was out there that night seemed focused on our cabin, on our windows, on our kids. The local rangers said it was probably just a bear, but I've lived around bears my whole life. Bears don't whistle, bears don't knock on windows in patterns, and bears definitely don't have glowing red eyes 8 feet off the ground. I still don't know what it was that night, and part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. There's something in those mountains that doesn't show up in any wildlife guide. Something that's smart enough to try to communicate, strong enough to leave prints that deep in the snow, and patient enough to spend hours trying to get into our cabin. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, still making its rounds, still whistling that almost melody in the dark. I've got the video and photos of the tracks saved on multiple hard drives, though I haven't shared them publicly. Part of me wants to delete them all and try to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I remember those knocks, that breathing, those eyes, and I know it wasn't imagination. I just hope I never have to hear that whistling again. Story 23. I've been struggling with whether or not to share this for months now, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened to me and my friends last October in Blue Ridge, Georgia, still keeps me up at night sometimes. I know how this might sound, but every word I'm about to write is true. I'm an experienced camper, been doing it since I was a kid with my dad, and I've spent countless nights in the Georgia wilderness. My friends Matt and Sarah are the same way. We're not some city folks who spook at every twig snap or owl hoot. That's why what happened that night shook us so badly. We'd picked a spot in the Chattahoochee National Forest, about 8 miles from the nearest proper road. It was a place I'd camped before, a small clearing surrounded by old-growth trees, with enough space for our 3 tents and a fire pit. The weather was perfect that weekend, crisp fall air, clear skies. We arrived around 2 p.m. and spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and following all the usual bear precautions. We hung our food bags at least 15 feet up between 2 trees, well away from our sleeping area. Standard procedure in bear country. The first sign that something was off came around sunset. We were sitting around the fire, having just finished dinner, when the birds suddenly went quiet. If you spend enough time outdoors, you know that's usually a warning sign. But we didn't see or hear anything obviously threatening, so we tried to shake it off. Around 9 p.m. the temperature had dropped, and we were huddled around the fire sharing stories when we heard it, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from the tree line about 50 yards behind my tent. It wasn't a bear's grunt or a coyote's howl. It was lower, more resonant, almost like someone playing a didgeridoo, but organic and wrong. Matt immediately reached for his flashlight, but when we shined it in that direction, we saw nothing but trees. "That had to be some kind of bird," Sarah said, but her voice was shaky. None of us believed it. We sat in tense silence for the next few minutes, straining to hear anything else. Then we heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite, just beyond where our firelight reached. Whatever it was big. Each step made a distinct thud that we could feel through the ground. The footsteps continued circling us for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. None of us dared move. I've encountered black bears before. They don't behave like this. They either run away or make a direct approach if they're after food. This felt calculated, almost like it was studying us. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, loud cracking noises from where we'd hung our food bags. Matt shined his flashlight in that direction, and what we saw still haunts me. Two of the trees we'd hung our bags between, healthy trees about 8 inches thick, were being pushed apart like they were saplings. The bags themselves were about 15 feet up, and something was reaching for them in the darkness. All we could make out was a massive dark shape moving against the night sky. We grabbed what we could and ran for the car, which was parked about 40 yards from our campsite. As we sprinted through the darkness, we could hear those heavy footsteps following us, but not directly chasing us, almost like it was pacing us from the tree line. We made it to my Ford Explorer and piled in, locking the doors. The next few hours were the longest of my life. We sat in the car, too terrified to sleep, listening to movement in the woods around us. Occasionally, we'd hear that same deep vocalization, sometimes from one side of the car, sometimes from the other. A few times, we heard what sounded like wood knocking against wood, 3 sharp raps, then silence. Around 3 a.m., something hit the side of the car, not hard enough to damage it, but enough to make the whole vehicle shake. Sarah started crying. I wanted to start the engine and get out of there, but I was terrified that the noise would provoke whatever was out there. As the sun started to rise around 6:30 a.m., the woods finally fell silent. We waited another hour before any of us worked up the courage to get out of the car. What we found turned my legs to jelly. Our campsite was ransacked, tents knocked over, supplies scattered. The trees where we'd hung our food were bent and stripped of bark about 7 to 8 feet up. The food bags themselves were gone. We found scraps of them about 100 yards into the woods. But the most chilling evidence was on the car itself. The morning dew had left the windows foggy, and there, clearly visible on the driver's side window, was a handprint. Not a bear print, a handprint. It was at least twice the size of my own hand, and it was pressed into the condensation at a height of over 7 feet from the ground. There were 4 more similar prints on other windows, all at the same height. We took some quick photos on our phones, but they didn't come out great in the morning light. The condensation was already starting to evaporate. We packed what was left of our gear and got out of there as fast as we could. The drive back to Atlanta was silent. What could we even say? I've gone back and forth about what we encountered that night. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or cryptozoologist. Before this, if someone had told me they'd seen Bigfoot, I'd have laughed it off. But I know what we experienced. I know what we saw. Those handprints were too high up for any person to make without a ladder, and we'd have heard someone dragging a ladder through the woods. The footsteps we felt through the ground were heavier than any known animal in these forests. The 3 of us have barely talked about it since then. Matt and Sarah don't go camping anymore. I've been out once, but only at a developed campground with other people nearby. I still can't shake the feeling that we were being watched and studied that night, not just stalked by some predator. Whatever it was out there was intelligent, and that's what scares me the most. I still have nightmares about those handprints on the windows, about that deep rumbling sound in the darkness. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear wood knocking in the distance, even though I live in the middle of the city now. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, but I needed to share it. If you're camping in North Georgia, especially around Blue Ridge, please be careful. There's something out there in those woods that defies explanation, and I hope I never encounter it again.